Nobody walks away from an Alpha King and lives to tell about it. Nobody except Celine Arden, the one woman who chose a human bastard over the most powerful werewolf alive. But here's what they don't tell you about power. It's not losing the throne that destroys you. It's realizing the woman you'd burn the world for never saw you as anything more than a monster wearing a crown. This is the story of King Riker Voss. And if you want to know how an empire crumbles when pride meets heartbreak, you better stick around until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my pack is listening. The smell hit Riker first. Not the iron tang of blood that usually perfumed the obsidian halls of Nightbane Palace. Not the bitter smoke from the warforges burning day and night at the kingdom's edge. This was different. Human sweat mixed with fear and something else. Something that made his wolf claw against his ribcage like it was trying to escape his own skin. He stood motionless in the doorway of the eastern guest chamber, one hand gripping the black stone doorframe hard enough that hairline cracks spiderwebbed beneath his fingers. The wood and iron door hung crooked on its hinges. Someone had kicked it open recently. Hard. Inside the room, Celine Arden pressed herself against the far wall between an overturned writing desk and a shattered mirror. Her gray servant's dress was torn at the shoulder. Rain from the open window had soaked through the fabric, making it cling to her frame. Her dark hair hung in wet tangles across her face. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the man standing between them. Cale Thorne. Human. 23 years old. Carpenter's son from the lower districts of the capital. Riker's investigators had compiled a full report within an hour of learning his name. The boy worked in the palace stables, fixed wagon wheels, repaired fence posts, kept his head down and his mouth shut like most humans did when living in a world ruled by creatures that could tear them apart without breaking stride. Unremarkable in every way, except one. Celine loved him. Riker had smelled it on her for weeks now. That shift in her scent when Kael's name came up in conversation. The way her heartbeat changed rhythm when the stable boy walked past during morning drills in the training yard. At first, Riker told himself it meant nothing, a passing infatuation, the kind of shallow attraction humans felt toward their own kind because they feared what they couldn't understand. But the wolf knew better. The wolf always knew. Now Kael stood in front of Celine with his shoulders squared and his hands balled into fists that would break against Riker's jaw before landing a single blow. The boy was shaking, not from cold, from the sheer primal terror that came with standing between an Alpha King and something that Alpha wanted. Brave. Stupid. Riker couldn't decide which. Actually, he thought, stepping into the room with movements so controlled they looked almost lazy. It didn't matter. Bravery and stupidity became the same thing when you died for it. Speak, his wolf snarled inside his skull. Make him understand. Make her understand. Make everyone understand that she belongs to us. But Riker's jaw stayed locked, because what could he possibly say that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was? A king begging a servant girl to choose the monster over the man. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of violence. Kael broke first. Your Majesty. His voice came out rough, unsteady, like he was forcing each word past his own survival instincts. I know what this looks like. Do you? Riker's voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the room anyway. Do you have any concept of what this looks like to me, boy? Kael flinched but held his ground. We weren't trying to disrespect you. We didn't choose this. Didn't choose it. Riker stepped deeper into the room. Each footfall echoed against stone floors that had witnessed 1,000 executions. Didn't choose to fall in love with a woman who stands inside my palace, eats food from my kitchens, wears dresses purchased with my coin. You didn't choose any of that. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? The words came out sharper than Riker intended. He watched Kael's pulse hammering in his throat, watched the boy's pupils dilate as the wolf inside Riker pushed closer to the surface. Explain to me how you accidentally ended up in her chambers at midnight with the door barred from the inside. Behind Kael, Celine finally moved. She stepped forward and put one hand on the carpenter's son's shoulder. Her fingers were shaking. Stop it, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade through silk. This isn't his fault. Riker's eyes locked onto her face. God, she was beautiful. Not in the polished, calculated way of the noble daughters who paraded through the throne room hoping to catch his attention. Celine's beauty was rawer than that. unrefined. It lived in the sharp angles of her jaw and the defiant tilt of her chin, and the way she looked at him like he was just a man instead of the creature that made armies kneel. His wolf had submitted to her the first night she'd stood before the throne, refusing to bow. Riker still didn't understand it, couldn't explain it. But submission from an alpha's wolf was a bond that ran deeper than blood, deeper than choice. It was instinct. And instinct was killing him now. Then whose fault is it? Riker asked. His hands hung loose at his sides, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight. Ready. The wolf wanted to surge forward, wanted to grab Kyle by the throat and show him exactly what happened when humans touch things that belong to the king. But Riker held himself still, because Celine was watching. "It's mine," she said. Her hand dropped from Kyle's shoulder. She stepped around him, putting herself fully between the two men. "I'm the one who asked him to come here. I'm the one who wanted to leave with him." The words punched through Riker's chest like a silver bullet. Leave. She wanted to leave. With him. Something in Riker's expression must have shifted because Kyle grabbed Celine's wrist and tried to pull her back. "Don't," the boy muttered. "You don't know what he'll do." Celine didn't move. "Yes, I do." She kept her eyes locked on Riker's face. "He'll try to scare me, try to remind me how powerful he is, how much control he has. But he won't hurt me." Kyle's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "How can you be sure?" "Because if he was going to kill me," she said softly, "he would have done it months ago." The truth of that statement settled over the room like ash after a fire. Riker stared at her. She stared back. And in that moment, every carefully constructed wall he'd built around himself since taking the crown started to crack. "You think I won't hurt you?" His voice came out hoarse, damaged. "You think there's a line I won't cross? I think you're terrified." Celine took another step toward him. Kyle made a strangled noise behind her, but she ignored it. "I think you've spent your whole life learning how to control everything around you, because you never learned how to control what's inside you. And now you're standing here trying to decide if you should kill the man I love or let him walk away, and you can't figure out which one makes you more of a monster." The accuracy of her words was its own kind of torture. Riker's hands curled into fists, his nails bit into his palms hard enough to draw blood. The wolf was screaming now, howling, demanding dominance, demanding submission, demanding anything except this unbearable powerlessness. "You don't get to psychoanalyze me," he said through clenched teeth. "You don't get to stand there and pretend you understand what it takes to rule a kingdom built on violence. Then tell me." Selena's voice stayed steady, but her eyes were bright, too bright. "Tell me what it takes, Riker. Tell me why a man who controls armies and breaks nobles with a word can't let go of one servant girl who never wanted his crown." The question hung in the air between them. Riker could have answered it 100 different ways. Could have listed every political reason why her presence in the palace had value. Could have explained the strategic advantage of keeping her close. Could have wrapped it all up in the cold logic of kingship and power. But they both would have known he was lying. "Because I can't," he finally said. The admission tasted like blood in his mouth. "I've tried. Every rational part of me knows you're a liability, a weakness my enemies will exploit, but I can't let you go." Celine's expression softened. Just slightly. Just enough to hurt worse than any blade. "That's not love, Riker." Her voice was gentle now, almost pitying. "That's obsession. Is there a difference?" He took a step toward her, then another. Kale started to move, but froze when Riker's eyes flicked toward him for just a second. When you lie awake at night thinking about someone, when their absence feels like a missing limb, when the idea of them choosing another man makes you want to burn the world down around you, what do you call that if not love? Celine held her ground even as he closed the distance between them. "I call it what happens when a man who's used to owning everything meets something he can't buy." "Wrong." Riker stopped just inches from her, close enough to smell the rain in her hair and the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "I could buy you 1,000 times over, could give you wealth, status, power beyond anything you've ever imagined. But you and I both know that's not what this is about. Then what is it about? You." The word came out broken, desperate. "Just you. The way you look at me like I'm not a king, like I'm just a man who might be worth saving." Behind them, Kyle shifted uncomfortably. The boy was smart enough to realize he was witnessing something that went far deeper than politics or power. This was something primal, something that lived in the space between want and need, and the terrible gray area where both became indistinguishable. Celine's hand came up slowly. For one impossible moment, Riker thought she might touch his face, might bridge the distance between them, but her hand stopped halfway. "I can't save you," she whispered. "No one can save you from yourself. Then come with me." The words spilled out before Riker could stop them. "Leave him. Leave all of this. I'll give you anything you want. Anything except freedom." Celine's hand dropped back to her side. "Anything except the right to choose my own life." "You're choosing him." Riker's jaw tightened as he glanced toward Kyle. "A boy who can barely hold a hammer steady. A human who will grow old and die while you're still young. What kind of choice is that?" "It's mine." Celine's voice hardened. "And that's the part you'll never understand. It doesn't matter if it's the right choice, or the smart choice, or the choice that makes any logical sense. It's mine. Not yours. Mine." The finality in her tone was worse than any rejection. Riker stepped back. "Then go." His voice was flat, empty. "Take him and leave the palace. Tonight. Before I change my mind." Celine's eyes widened. "You're letting us go? What choice do I have?" A bitter laugh escaped him. "You just made it very clear that keeping you here against your will makes me exactly the monster you think I am. So go. Run away with your carpenter. Build whatever life you think you'll find outside these walls." He turned away from her then, couldn't bear to look at her face anymore. "But Riker," her voice was softer now, uncertain. "No." He held up one hand without turning around. "Don't say anything else. Don't thank me. Don't apologize. Just go before every part of me that still knows how to care about something other than power decides that keeping you is worth becoming the villain in your story." Silence. Then footsteps. Celine moving across the stone floor toward the door, toward Kyle, toward the life she'd chosen over everything Riker could have given her. The wolf inside him howled. "Let her go," Riker told himself. "Let her walk away. Prove you're more than the monster she thinks you are." But as her footsteps faded down the corridor outside, something else whispered in the back of his mind. A king who loses control loses everything, and Riker Voss had just lost the only thing that ever made him feel human. The throne room was empty when Riker returned. He stood in the center of the vast obsidian hall, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move independent of any light source. The black stone throne loomed at the far end of the room like a judge waiting to pass sentence. Riker didn't sit. Instead, he walked to the eastern wall where a massive map of the Black Dominion stretched from floor to ceiling. Territories marked in blood-red ink, cities conquered and held through fear, trade routes secured by armies that answered only to him. An empire, built on violence and maintained through absolute control, and none of it meant a damn thing if he couldn't control his own heart. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall, heavy, deliberate. Riker didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You let her leave." General Cassian Dragor's voice was carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that came from a man who'd served under Riker long enough to know when his king was close to snapping. "Yes. The Council won't like it. The Council can burn." Riker traced one finger along the map, following the border between the Black Dominion and the Eastern Territories where rebellion had been brewing for months. She made her choice. "And you're just going to accept that?" Cassian moved closer. The general was one of the few men alive who could stand in Riker's presence without flinching. They'd fought together, bled together, built this empire together from the ashes of the old regime. But that didn't mean Cassian understood. "What would you have me do?" Riker asked without turning around. "Chain her in the dungeons? Force her into a crown she never wanted? Turn her into a prisoner and call it love? I'd have you remember who you are." Cassian's reflection appeared in the polished obsidian wall beside Riker's. "You're the Alpha King, the man who unified 7 warring clans through sheer force of will. You don't beg, you don't plead, and you certainly don't let some human girl dictate terms. She's not some human girl." "No? Then what is she?" Riker finally turned to face his general, the only person alive who might understand the answer to that question. She's the one thing in this world I can't dominate, he said quietly, and that makes her either the most dangerous creature I've ever encountered or the only honest thing I've ever wanted. Cassian studied him for a long moment. Then she's a weakness. Yes. And weaknesses get exploited. I know. The general moved to stand beside Riker, both men staring at the map now. The Eastern Lords have been waiting for an opportunity like this. News of your attachment to a human servant has already spread through the noble houses. They're calling you compromised. Let them talk. They're doing more than talking. Cassian's voice dropped lower. Lord Maddox sent a formal challenge to your claim this morning. He's gathering support from the Southern Territories. Says an alpha who can't control his own household has no business controlling a kingdom. Riker's hands curled into fists. Maddox had been looking for an excuse to rebel for years. The old bastard still believed in the ancient pack laws where strength meant everything and sentiment meant nothing. To him, Riker's attachment to Selene was proof of corruption, proof that the king had gone soft. Maybe he was right. When do they move? Riker asked. 3 days. Cassian gestured to the Eastern Territories on the map. Maybe 4 if we're lucky. They're gathering forces at Bloodfang Citadel. Maddox has convinced at least 5 other houses to join him. How many troops? Conservative estimate? 15,000. Could be more if he's been recruiting from the outlying clans. Riker did the math in his head. The palace guard numbered 8,000. Well-trained, loyal, but outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 if Maddox had his full force assembled. We could call in reinforcements from the Western Territories, Cassian offered. Lord Thane owes you a blood debt. He'd answer. No. Riker shook his head. If we pull forces from the west, the coastal lords will see it as opportunity to move on the port cities. We can't fight a war on 2 fronts. Then what do you want to do? Win. Riker's voice hardened. We meet Maddox at Bloodfang, crush his rebellion before it spreads, show every noble house in this kingdom what happens when they mistake patience for weakness. Cassian nodded slowly. And the girl? If Maddox's forces capture her, they won't, because she'll be long gone by then. The general's expression flickered with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. Riker couldn't tell which. You're protecting her even now, Cassian observed, even after she chose someone else. Old habits. Riker turned away from the map and started toward the throne. Or maybe I'm just trying to hold on to the last piece of myself that still remembers what it feels like to care about something other than survival. He sank into the obsidian throne. The cold stone pressed against his back like an old friend, like a reminder of everything he'd sacrificed to sit here. Assemble the war council, he told Cassian. I want every general, every commander, every soldier who's ever bled for this crown ready to march by sunrise. The general bowed. It will be done. And Cassian? Yes, my king? Riker stared at the empty throne room, at the shadows dancing across stone floors stained with centuries of blood. If I fall at Bloodfang, he said quietly, make sure she never knows it was because of her. Cassian was silent for a moment. Then, you won't fall. How can you be sure? Because the man I've followed for 15 years doesn't know how to lose. The general's voice carried absolute certainty. You'll win this war the same way you've won every other war, through ruthlessness and rage and the sheer refusal to let anything stand between you and what you want. And what if what I want walked out of this palace with a stable boy? Then you'll find a way to want something else. Cassian started toward the door but paused at the threshold. That's what kings do, Riker. We adapt. We survive. We rule. The general's footsteps faded into the distance. Riker sat alone on his throne, surrounded by darkness and the weight of a crown that suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Selene's hand was shaking as she packed the small leather bag. Not much to take. A change of clothes, a water skin. The small knife her brother had given her before he died, fighting in one of Riker's border wars. Everything else she owned technically belonged to the palace anyway. Belonged to him. Kale stood near the window, watching the palace grounds below. Guards moved through the courtyards in their usual patterns. Everything looked normal, peaceful, but Selene could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. We should go now, Kyle said without turning around, before he changes his mind. He won't change his mind. Selene tied the bag closed and slung it over her shoulder. Whatever else Riker is, He keeps his word. You sound almost sad about it. She was. God help her, she was. Because part of her had expected him to fight, to rage, to refuse to let her go no matter what she said, or how hard she pushed back. That was the Riker she knew, the Alpha King who bent the world to his will and burned anything that wouldn't bend. But tonight he'd just stepped aside. And somehow that hurt worse than any chains ever could. Are you sure about this? Kale turned to look at her now. His face was pale in the candlelight. They were taking a massive risk and they both knew it. Even with the king's permission, leaving the palace meant entering a world that wasn't particularly kind to humans who'd caught the attention of powerful alphas. I'm sure about you. Celine crossed the room and took his hand. That's enough. Kael squeezed her fingers gently. I just don't want you to regret it later. To wake up one morning in some tiny village and wish you'd stayed here with... Don't. She cut him off before he could finish the thought. Don't do that to yourself. I chose you, Kael. I chose the man who sees me as a person instead of a possession. He nodded, but the doubt didn't completely leave his eyes. They slipped out of the chamber and into the servant corridors that ran like veins through the palace's east wing. Celine had mapped these passages months ago, knew which routes the guards patrolled and which ones stayed empty during shift changes. The stable entrance was unguarded when they reached it 20 minutes later. 2 horses were already saddled and waiting. Someone had left them there. Probably one of the stable hands who owed Kael a favor. Or maybe Riker had arranged it. That thought shouldn't have made Selena's chest tighten the way it did. She swung up onto her horse and waited while Kael mounted his. The night air was cool against her skin. Stars scattered across the sky above them like broken glass. Ready? Kael asked. No. But Celine took a breath and nodded anyway. Let's go. They rode out through the eastern gate and into the capital city beyond. Nightbane sprawled below the palace like a living thing. Buildings stacked on top of each other, markets that never fully closed, the constant hum of a city that served as the beating heart of the Black Dominion. Celine had lived here her whole life, had walked these streets as a child, had learned to survive in the spaces between power and poverty where most humans existed. And now she was leaving it all behind. For what? A small voice whispered in the back of her mind. For a carpenter's son and the promise of a normal life? Yes, she told herself firmly, for the chance to be something other than a pawn in someone else's game. They made it to the outer districts before the first scream cut through the night. Kael pulled his horse up short. What was that? Celine turned in her saddle, looking back toward the palace. Flames had erupted from somewhere near the western wall. Orange light painted the sky. Then more screams, bells began ringing, the alarm signal that meant the city was under attack. We need to keep moving, Kael said. Whatever's happening back there? No. Celine's stomach dropped. This isn't random. What do you mean? She thought about Cassian's words in the throne room, thought about the tension she'd felt building over the past weeks, the whispered conversations among the noble houses, the way certain lords looked at Riker during council meetings like they were measuring him for a coffin. Someone's making their move, she said. Someone waited until they thought Riker was distracted. The rebellion. Kael's face went pale. The Eastern Lords. They wouldn't attack the palace directly. Celine's mind raced. Too well defended. But if they struck at the city first, caused chaos, drew the guard out, then they could move on the throne while Riker's forces were scattered. Kael finished the thought. His hands tightened on the reins. We need to warn him. He knows. Celine stared at the flames spreading through the western district. Men like Riker always know when someone's coming for their crown. The question is whether he has enough support to hold against it. More explosions lit up the night sky. The attack wasn't just happening in one place. It was coordinated, surgical, designed to spread the palace guard thin across multiple crisis points. Whoever was leading this knew exactly what they were doing. Celine's horse shifted nervously beneath her. Kael was right. They needed to keep moving, needed to get out of the city before the violence spread. But something held her frozen, because Riker was in there, fighting alone against enemies who'd been waiting years for this moment. And despite everything, despite choosing Kael, despite walking away from the crown and the chaos and the monster who'd tried to cage her with obsession disguised as love, She couldn't shake the feeling that leaving him now was the same as condemning him to die. "Celine," Kael said urgently, "we have to go." She looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man she'd chosen because he represented safety and normalcy and all the things her life had lacked since the day she'd been dragged into the palace after witnessing that assassination attempt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Then she wheeled her horse around and rode back toward the flames. Kael's shout followed her into the darkness, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because maybe Riker was right. Maybe there wasn't a difference between love and obsession when your heart refused to follow logic. The Western District burned. Riker moved through the chaos like death wearing a crown. His claws were extended. Blood slicked his arms up to the elbows. Bodies littered the street behind him. Rebels, hired mercenaries, a few palace guards who'd turned traitor for the right price. All dead now. Cassian fought somewhere to his right, leading a squad of loyalists against a group of insurgents who'd barricaded themselves inside a merchant's warehouse. The sounds of combat echoed off stone walls, steel against steel, screams cut short. This wasn't war. It was slaughter. And Riker was good at slaughter. "Your Majesty!" A young lieutenant ran up, breathing hard. His face was covered in soot. "The eastern gate is under heavy assault. Lord Maddox's forces are trying to breach the inner wall." "How many?" Riker didn't slow his pace. "At least 3,000 that we can see. Could be more in reserve." 3,000. Against the 8,000 palace guards split across 4 different attack points. The math wasn't in Riker's favor. "Pull everyone from the southern perimeter," he ordered. "Reinforce the eastern gate. If that wall falls, the whole city falls with it." The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, if we abandon the south, then the southern districts burn." Riker's voice was flat, cold. "We protect what matters. Everything else is expendable." The lieutenant's face went pale, but he saluted and ran off to relay the orders. Cassian emerged from the warehouse with blood dripping from his sword. The building behind him had gone up in flames. "Prisoners?" Riker asked. "None left alive to question." "Good." Riker started toward the eastern wall. "The sooner we end this, the fewer people die." They moved through streets packed with civilians fleeing the violence. Men carrying children, women dragging elderly parents, everyone running from the fire and the screams and the certainty that their city was tearing itself apart. Riker had seen this before, had caused it before, but watching it happen to his own capital felt different, felt personal in a way that made the wolf inside him rage against the cage of his ribs. The eastern gate came into view 5 minutes later, and Riker's blood went cold. The wall was already breached, not broken, not battered down. Someone had opened it from the inside. Traitors within the guard. Maddox's forces were pouring through the gap like a flood, thousands of them. More than the lieutenant had reported. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was an invasion. Cassian swore viciously. "We can't hold this. We don't have a choice." Riker drew the obsidian blade that had belonged to his father, the one he'd used to take the crown 15 years ago. "We hold or we die." The general nodded grimly. Then they charged. What happened next became the stuff of legends. Riker Voss fought like a creature possessed. His wolf surged to the surface, transforming his body into something caught between man and beast. Claws that could tear through armor. Speed that made him impossible to track. Strength that sent full-grown men flying through the air like rag dolls. He was everywhere at once, cutting through enemy lines, breaking formations, killing anyone who stood between him and Lord Maddox's position at the center of the invading force. The rebel lord saw him coming. Maddox was old, nearly 70 winters, but alphas aged differently than humans, and the Eastern Lord had spent decades honing his skills in combat. He met Riker's charge with a roar that shook the ground. Steel rang against obsidian, 2 kings fighting for the same crown. Around them, the battle devolved into pure chaos. Palace guards fought desperately to push back the tide. Rebels pressed forward, sensing victory. And somewhere in the distance, Riker heard something that made his heart stop. Celine's voice, screaming his name. She'd made it as far as the merchant quarter before the eastern wall fell. Celine watched from a rooftop 2 streets away as Maddox's forces flooded into the city. Watched Riker and Cassian throw themselves at an army that outnumbered them 3-1. Watched the man she'd walked away from fight like he was willing to die before he'd surrender his crown. This is what you wanted, she told herself. Freedom from all of this. From the violence and the politics and the endless game of power. But the words felt hollow as she watched Riker go down beneath a wave of attackers. He rose again seconds later, covered in blood that wasn't his, but there were too many. Even the Alpha King couldn't fight forever against odds like this. Celine looked around frantically. The city was burning. People were dying. And she was just standing here watching it happen like a spectator at some horrific theater. Then her eyes landed on something that made her breath catch. The War Tower. The old defensive structure stood 3 blocks from the eastern wall. It hadn't been used in decades, not since Riker's father had modernized the palace defenses. But Celine remembered stories from her childhood, stories about how the War Tower's bells could be heard across the entire city when they rang. Stories about how those bells had once signaled the call to arms for every able-bodied fighter in Nightbane. She ran, down from the rooftop, through alleys clogged with refugees, past buildings that were collapsing under the weight of the fires spreading through the district. The War Tower's door was locked, but the wood was old, rotted. Celine threw her full weight against it twice before it splintered and gave way. Inside, dust covered everything. The rope that controlled the bells hung from the ceiling like a serpent waiting to strike. Celine grabbed it with both hands and pulled. Nothing happened. She pulled harder. The rope gave way with a groan that sounded almost alive. Then the bells began to ring, deep, resonant, a sound that carried across the burning city like the voice of God itself. Below her in the streets, people stopped running, heads turned toward the tower. And Celine realized she'd just done something incredibly stupid or incredibly brave, and she wasn't sure which. Because every fighter who heard those bells would remember the old laws, the ancient codes that said when the War Tower rang, every citizen of Nightbane was called to defend their home. Even the humans, especially the humans. Within minutes, the streets began filling with people carrying weapons. Merchants with cleavers, blacksmiths with hammers, farmers with pitchforks and rage in their eyes. They poured toward the eastern gate like a second wave. Not trained soldiers, just people who decided they were tired of watching their city burn. And at the center of it all, bleeding and surrounded by enemies, Riker Voss heard the bells and understood what they meant. Someone had called the city to war. He looked up toward the War Tower, saw a small figure silhouetted against the flames, recognized her even from this distance. For just a moment, their eyes met across the chaos. Then Maddox's blade came down and Riker barely blocked it in time. The old lord was grinning. "She came back?" he taunted. "The little human girl came back to watch you die." "Wrong." Riker slammed his forehead into Maddox's face hard enough to break bone. "She came back to burn your rebellion to the ground." The civilian wave hit Maddox's forces like a hammer, untrained but furious, outnumbered but determined. They threw themselves at the invaders with the kind of desperation that came from defending home. The tide began to turn. Palace guards rallied, pushed forward, started reclaiming ground they'd lost. Cassian appeared at Riker's side, breathing hard. "Did you plan this?" "No." Riker blocked another strike from Maddox and drove his obsidian blade through the old lord's chest. "But I'll take it." Maddox fell. His forces saw it happen, saw their leader die on the Alpha King's sword, and the rebellion broke. Within an hour, it was over. Maddox's army scattered. Some surrendered. Most fled back through the eastern gate and disappeared into the territories beyond the Black Dominion's border. The city fell silent except for the crackling of fires and the moans of the wounded. Riker stood in the center of the carnage and let the wolf recede, let himself become human again. Every muscle in his body screamed, blood soaked through his clothes. He was pretty sure at least 3 ribs were broken, but he was alive. His kingdom was intact, and Celine was walking toward him through the smoke and ash like a ghost emerging from the wreckage of her own choices. She stopped 5 feet away. Neither of them spoke. What do you say to someone who walked away from you and then came back to save your life? What do you say to someone who fought like a demon to keep a crown you never wanted but rang the bells anyway because watching him die was apparently worse than choosing someone else? "You're bleeding," Celine finally said. "So are you." Riker gestured to the cut on her forehead. "Must have happened during the climb up the tower." She touched the wound absently. "Didn't even realize." "The War Tower bells." Riker's voice was rough. "Damaged. That was you." Yes. Why? Celine met his eyes. Because despite everything, despite walking away and choosing a different life, and knowing you're probably going to break my heart if I let you, I couldn't watch you die. A bitter laugh escaped him. So you came back to save the monster? No. She stepped closer. I came back because maybe you're not the monster I thought you were. Or maybe I'm tired of pretending I don't feel something for the man underneath all that rage and control. The admission hung between them like a confession whispered in the dark. Riker wanted to close the distance, wanted to pull her against him and never let go, but his hands stayed at his sides. Because he didn't know what this meant. Didn't know if she'd come back for him, or just come back because the bells needed ringing and he happened to be the one dying. Where's Kyle? He asked. The question landed like a blade. Celine's expression flickered. I don't know. I left him outside the city when I rode back. He probably thinks I'm insane. Probably right. Riker watched her face for any sign of regret, any indication that she wished she'd stayed with the carpenter's son instead of returning to the burning capital and the Alpha King. But her eyes stayed locked on his. I made a choice tonight, she said quietly. I'm not saying it's the right choice. I'm not saying I won't regret it tomorrow. But I chose to come back. Why? The question came out desperate. Broken? Because you felt sorry for me? Because some part of you still thinks you can save me from myself? No. Celine reached out slowly and pressed her hand against his chest, right over his heart. Because when I heard those bells ringing and saw you fighting down there, I realized something. What? That maybe the thing I've been running from isn't the monster. It's the fact that I might be just as broken as you are. And broken things either shatter completely or they learn how to fit together. Riker closed his eyes, felt her heartbeat against his palm, felt the weight of everything they'd said and everything they hadn't. Then Cassian's voice shattered the moment. My king! The general's tone was tight, controlled. We have a problem. Riker opened his eyes and saw what Cassian was looking at. The eastern horizon had gone dark, not with night, with movement. Thousands of shapes moving across the plains beyond the broken gate. More forces. A second wave that made Maddox's initial assault look like a scouting party. And at the front of that approaching army, a banner flew that made Riker's blood turn to ice. The Crimson Wolf. Lord Thane's sigil. The Western Lord who owed Riker a blood debt. The one ally he thought he could count on. Marching toward Nightbane with an army that dwarfed everything they'd just survived. Cassian moved closer. His hand was on his sword. That's at least 20,000 troops. Maybe more. Riker stared at the approaching forces and felt something crack inside him. Because he'd just fought off one rebellion. He just barely survived with the help of untrained civilians and a girl who came back when she should have kept running. And now the one person he'd trusted was bringing an army to finish what Maddox started. We can't win this, Cassian said quietly. Not with what we have left. Riker looked at Celine, at the woman who'd rung the bells and changed everything, at the person who made him feel human right before his empire crumbled completely. Then he made a decision that would change everything. Get her out of here, he told Cassian. Take Celine and whatever loyal guard you can find. Ride west through the mountain passes. Don't stop until you're across the border. What? Celine's eyes went wide. No, I'm not leaving you again. You don't have a choice. Riker turned to face her fully. Thane's forces will reach the city by dawn. When they do, everyone loyal to me dies. That includes you. Then we fight together. There's no together in this. His voice was harder now, colder. This is war, real war, the kind where there's no room for sentiment or noble sacrifices. You rang the bells and saved my life tonight. Now let me return the favor by making sure you survive what comes next. Behind them, Cassian was already moving, gathering the remaining officers, preparing horses. Celine grabbed Riker's arm. Her fingers dug into the torn fabric of his sleeve. I didn't come back just to watch you throw your life away. I'm not throwing it away. Riker covered her hand with his own. I'm buying you time. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing. Then close your eyes. He pulled her closer. Let himself hold her for just one moment before everything ended. Because what's coming next isn't something you should have to see. Riker, promise me. His voice dropped to a whisper that only she could hear. Promise me you'll run when I tell you to, that you'll let Cassian get you somewhere safe, that you won't look back. Tears were running down her face now, cutting clean tracks through the ash and blood. I can't, she whispered. You have to. Because if you die here, if Thane's forces capture you and use you against me, I won't just fight them. I'll burn the entire world down until there's nothing left but ash and regret. And that's not the man you came back to save. The truth of it settled over both of them. Celine pressed her forehead against his chest. You're asking me to choose you by leaving you. Yes. That's not fair. I know. Riker's hand came up to cradle the back of her head. But it's the only choice either of us has left. Cassian reappeared with 6 horses and a dozen guards who looked like they'd been through hell, which they had. It's time, the general said grimly. Riker released Celine and stepped back. Their eyes met one last time. And in that moment, all the things they'd never said hung between them like ghosts waiting to be acknowledged. I'll find you, Celine said. Her voice was steady despite the tears. When this is over, when you've won or lost or burned everything to the ground. I'll find you. Then you better hope I win, because the man who survives what's coming might not be worth finding. She mounted the horse Cassian brought for her, looked down at Riker one last time, then rode into the darkness with Cassian and the others. Riker stood alone in the ruins of his capital and watched her disappear. Watched the only good thing in his life ride away. And then he turned to face the army approaching from the east. 20,000 troops against the broken remnants of his guard. No allies. No backup. Just him and whatever was left of his rage. The wolf rose inside him, hungry, ready, and for the first time in his life, Riker Voss smiled at the approach of his own destruction. Because if he was going to fall, if this was the end of the Alpha King and everything he'd built, then he'd make damn sure the world remembered how a monster died. Dawn broke over Nightbane like a wound splitting open. Riker stood on the eastern wall and watched Lord Thane's army spread across the plains like a plague. 20,000 warriors moving in perfect formation. Siege engines rolling forward on wheels that carved trenches into the earth. Cavalry units flanking the main force in a pincer movement designed to crush any attempt at escape. This wasn't a rebellion. It was an execution. Behind Riker, what remained of the palace guard assembled in the courtyard below. Maybe 3,000 troops still fit to fight. The rest were dead or wounded or scattered across a city that looked like it had been chewed up and spit out by something massive and hungry. The numbers didn't lie. This was suicide. And every man standing in that courtyard knew it. General Thorne appeared at Riker's side. Not Cassian. The younger general had ridden out with Celine hours ago. Thorne was older, scarred, the kind of soldier who'd seen enough wars to know when one was already lost. My king. Thorne's voice was careful, measured. We could still negotiate. Thane might accept terms if we what? Riker didn't take his eyes off the approaching army. Offer him the crown? Apologize for existing? Explain that his blood debt means nothing when there's power to be seized? Thorne was silent, because they both knew the truth. Thane hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to replace one king with another. And in the brutal mathematics of pack law, the old king needed to die before the new one could take the throne. How long until they reached the walls? Riker asked. 2 hours. Maybe less if they push hard. Then we have 2 hours to decide how we want to die. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Riker finally turned to look at his general. Thorne had served under him for 12 years, had fought in 7 major campaigns, had killed men in Riker's name and never once questioned the orders. Now the old soldier just looked tired. You could run, Thorne said quietly. Take the tunnels beneath the palace. Be 10 miles away before Thane breaches the gates. And abandon everyone who stayed loyal? Riker shook his head. That's not how kings die. It's how smart kings survive. I stopped being smart the moment I let her walk into my life. Riker's jaw tightened. Now I'm just trying to make sure my stupidity doesn't kill everyone else. She came back. Thorne's expression softened slightly. The servant girl, she rang the war bells. That means something. It means she has a better heart than I deserve. Riker turned back to watch Thane's forces advancing. But it doesn't change the math. We're outnumbered 7-1. Our walls are already damaged from Maddox's assault. Half our troops are exhausted. This isn't a battle we can win through courage or loyalty or any of the pretty words we tell soldiers before we send them to die. Then what do? We make them pay. Riker's voice hardened. Every inch they take costs blood. Every man who falls defending this city becomes a reminder that the Black Dominion doesn't bend easily. And when I finally go down, I go down in a way that makes every alpha in this kingdom think twice before trying to take what's mine. Thorne nodded slowly. I'll inform the men. Tell them the truth. Riker met the general's eyes. Tell them they're about to fight for a king who lost control, who let sentiment cloud judgment, who broke every rule our fathers taught us about power and survival. Then tell them they can leave if they want. No judgment, no consequences. Just walk away before the killing starts. And if they stay, then we make this the most expensive crown Thane ever tried to steal. The general saluted and headed back down to the courtyard. Riker remained on the wall alone. The wind carried smoke from fires still burning in the western district, carried the smell of death and ash and the particular stench that comes when a city tears itself apart from the inside. This was his fault, all of it. A stronger king would have controlled his obsession, would have recognized Selene as the weakness she was and eliminated the problem before it grew teeth, would have ruled through fear and calculation instead of letting his wolf submit to a girl with defiant eyes and human blood. But Riker had never been particularly good at being the king he was supposed to be. His father had tried to beat that weakness out of him, literally. The scar across Riker's throat was proof of that. The old king believed sentiment made rulers soft, made them vulnerable, made them the kind of target that rebellions gathered around like flies on rotting meat. He'd been right. Riker touched the scar absently, felt the raised tissue beneath his fingers. His father had died badly, poisoned by someone in his inner circle who'd gotten close enough to slip nightshade into his wine. They never found out who, never even came close, because the old king had been so busy controlling everything around him that he never noticed the knife coming from inside his own court. Control was survival, he'd always said, but control hadn't saved him. And it wouldn't save Riker either. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so damn tragic. Movement below caught his attention. The troops were forming up in defensive positions. Archers on the walls, infantry blocking the gates, cavalry held in reserve for a counterattack that would probably never come. 3,000 men preparing to die because their king had fallen in love with the wrong woman. Riker's hands curled into fists. The wolf inside him was unusually quiet. Not sleeping, just waiting, like it understood that rage wouldn't save them this time. That all the dominance and fury that had built this empire meant nothing against the simple reality of being outnumbered and outmaneuvered. For the first time in his life, Riker Voss felt genuinely powerless. And the worst part was knowing Selene had been right about him. He'd spent his entire existence trying to control everything, because deep down, beneath the crown and the violence and the carefully maintained image of the untouchable Alpha King, he was terrified of the one thing no amount of power could prevent: loss. Losing the throne, losing his life, losing the few people he'd ever let himself care about. And now it was all happening at once. A horn sounded across the plains. Thane's army had begun its final advance. Riker took a breath and headed down to the courtyard to die beside his men. Ugh. Selene's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She gripped the reins harder, trying to force them steady, but her body refused to cooperate. Behind her, Cassian and the remaining guards rode in tight formation. Silent. Grim. They'd been riding for 3 hours, west through the mountain passes like Riker had ordered, away from Nightbane, away from the war, away from the man who'd just sacrificed himself to buy them time. The sun was rising behind them, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Selene didn't look back. Couldn't look back. Because if she did, she'd turn around, would ride straight back into the chaos, would throw away everything Riker had just given up to protect. "He's going to die," a voice whispered in her head. "You know that, right? He's going to die fighting an army he can't beat because you came back and made him think he had something worth protecting." The thought made her chest tight, made breathing difficult. Cassian moved his horse closer. His face was carefully neutral. "You're thinking about going back?" It wasn't a question. Selene met his eyes. "Would it matter if I was?" "Yes." The general's voice was flat. "Because I gave my king an oath to keep you alive. And I don't break oaths, even if keeping me alive means letting him die alone." especially then. Cassian looked away. You think you're the first person Riker sacrificed himself for? You think you're special in that regard? The words stung more than they should have. Celine forced herself to focus on the path ahead. The mountain pass was narrow here, rocky, the kind of terrain that favored ambush. How far to the border? She asked. Another 4 hours if we push hard. Cassian gestured to the mountains rising around them. Once we cross into the Western Territories, we can find sanctuary with the clans that owe Riker favors. And if Thane wins, if he takes the capital, then those favors become worthless. The general's jaw tightened. But we deal with that problem after we get you somewhere safe. I didn't ask for this. Celine's voice came out harsher than intended. Didn't ask to be the reason a king throws away his life. No one asks to be the thing a broken man fixates on. Cassian's tone softened slightly. But that doesn't change what you are to him. And what am I exactly? The thing he couldn't control. The general met her eyes again. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How many queens and nobles and warriors have thrown themselves at Riker over the years trying to gain his favor, trying to become the thing that matters to the Alpha King? Celine didn't answer. All of them failed, Cassian continued, because Riker never let anyone close enough to matter, never gave anyone power over him. Then you showed up. A servant girl who refused to kneel, who looked at him like he was just a man, and his wolf submitted. I didn't want that. Doesn't matter. The bond happened anyway. And once an alpha's wolf submits, there's no taking it back, no controlling it. It just is. The trail widened slightly. The guards spread out, scanning the surrounding rocks for threats. Celine tried to process what Cassian was saying, tried to understand how she'd gone from a nobody witnessing an assassination to the reason an empire was collapsing. I should have stayed away, she said quietly. Should have run the first night instead of letting him keep me at the palace. Probably. Cassian's expression was grim. But you didn't, and now here we are. Here we are. Celine repeated the words like they might make more sense the second time. Running away while the man I came back to save fights a war he can't win. You came back. That's what matters. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, all I did was give him false hope, made him think there was something worth surviving for. Then I left again when things got hard. Cassian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made Celine's blood run cold. You didn't give him false hope. You gave him a reason to die like a king instead of a coward. There's a difference. The trail curved sharply. They followed it deeper into the mountains, and Celine realized with growing horror that Cassian was right. Riker had sent her away not because he thought he could win, but because he knew he was going to lose. And he wanted her to remember him as the man who'd protected her one last time instead of the monster who'd dragged her down with him. The thought was unbearable. She pulled her horse to a stop. The guards immediately went on alert. Cassian wheeled around, hand on his sword. What is it? Ambush? No. Celine's voice was steady now. Certain. I'm going back. The general's face went hard. No, you're not. You can't stop me. Watch me. Cassian moved his horse to block the trail. I gave Riker my word. That means more to me than your guilt or your sentiment or whatever romantic notion you have about dying beside him. This isn't about romance. Celine met his glare without flinching. This is about the fact that I made a choice. I chose to come back. I chose to ring those bells and stand with him. And now I'm choosing not to run while he bleeds out defending a city I helped save. He ordered you to go. He doesn't get to make that choice for me. Yes. Cassian's voice was pure steel now. He does. That's what it means to be king. You make the hard choices so other people don't have to live with the consequences. Then he's a better person than I am. Celine's hands tightened on the reins. Because I can't live with the consequence of abandoning him. The two of them stared at each other. Around them, the guards shifted uncomfortably. This was the kind of standoff that ended badly, no matter who won. Finally, one of the younger soldiers spoke up. His voice was hesitant. General, if she wants to go back, maybe we should let her. Cassian rounded on him. You want to explain to your king's ghost why you let the one person he died to protect ride straight back into the slaughter? The soldier flinched but held his ground. I want to explain to myself why I ran when my brothers were fighting. The words hit like a physical blow, because that was the truth none of them wanted to acknowledge. They'd followed orders, had escorted Celine to safety, had done exactly what Riker commanded, but every single one of them felt like a coward for it. Cassian looked at each guard in turn, saw the same shame reflected in their faces. Then he looked back at Celine. "If we go back," he said slowly, "we all die. You understand that? Thane's forces will show no mercy. We'll be outnumbered 20 to 1. There's no heroic last stand, no miraculous victory, just death." "I know," Celine's voice didn't waver. "And you still want to go?" "I don't want to, but I'm going to." The general closed his eyes, let out a long breath that sounded like surrender. "Riker's going to kill me himself if we somehow survive this," he muttered. "Then we better make sure he lives long enough to try." Celine turned her horse back toward Nightbane. Cassian signaled the guards. They formed up around her without hesitation, and together they rode back toward the war. Net. The first wave hit the eastern wall at dawn. Riker fought from the battlements, his obsidian blade moving in arcs that painted the air red. Bodies fell. Ladders burned. The defenders held, but barely. Thane's forces were relentless, professional. They advanced in rotating shifts so fresh troops constantly pressured the exhausted defenders. Siege engines hurled stones that punched holes in walls already weakened by Maddox's assault. The mathematics of attrition were clear. The defenders were losing. General Thorne appeared beside Riker, bleeding from a gash across his forehead. The southern gate just fell. Enemy forces are pouring into the lower districts. How many? Too many. Thorne wiped blood from his eyes. We need to fall back to the inner keep, consolidate our remaining forces. And abandon half the city? Riker blocked a spear thrust and threw the attacker off the wall. Not while I'm still breathing. Then you won't be breathing much longer. The general's voice was urgent. My king, please. If we lose you, we lose everything. We've already lost everything. Riker gestured at the burning city below. Look at it, Thorne. This is what happens when kings choose sentiment over strategy, when they let their hearts overrule their heads. You're not the first ruler to love the wrong person. No. But I might be the last one stupid enough to die for it. An explosion rocked the wall beneath them. Stone crumbled. Men screamed as they fell into the chaos below. Riker grabbed Thorne's arm. Get everyone to the throne room. Make your stand there. Hold as long as you can. And you? I'm going to buy you time. Riker's eyes glowed silver. The wolf was rising now, hungry, ready. Sometimes the only way a king can save his kingdom is by becoming the monster everyone fears. Before Thorne could argue, Riker jumped, 30 feet down into the mass of enemy soldiers flooding through the broken gate. He landed in a crouch that cracked stone beneath his boots. Then he transformed. Not completely. Alphas rarely went full wolf, but the hybrid form was more than enough. Riker became something caught between man and beast, 7 feet tall, muscles corded with power that could snap steel, claws that carved through armor like paper, and he tore into Thane's forces with the kind of fury that legends were built on. Men died in chunks. Blood painted the cobblestones. Screams echoed off buildings as the Alpha King became exactly what his father had tried to create. A weapon, pure, unstoppable, terrifying. The enemy line broke. Soldiers scattered. Even the most hardened warriors felt the primal fear that came with facing an Alpha in full rage. But there were too many. For every man Riker killed, 3 more took his place. Spears drove into his sides. Swords opened wounds across his back. Silver-tipped arrows punched through muscle. He kept fighting, because stopping meant dying. And dying meant Thane won. Then a voice cut through the chaos. Riker! He turned and saw something impossible. Celine, riding through the broken gate on a horse slicked with foam, Cassian beside her, a dozen guards forming a wedge around them. They'd come back. Time seemed to slow. Riker's heart stopped beating for one impossible moment, because this couldn't be happening. She was supposed to be safe, supposed to be miles away, supposed to be the one good thing that survived the destruction of everything he'd built. Instead, she was here, riding into the slaughter, and the look on her face said she knew exactly what she'd done. What are you doing? The words came out as a roar that shook windows. I told you to run! Celine pulled her horse up 10 feet away. I'm done running from the things that scare me. Around them, the battle had paused. Enemy soldiers backing away from the Alpha King and the cavalry that had just punched through their lines. This is suicide! Riker's voice was desperate now. Broken. You can't be here. Neither can you. Celine dismounted, walked toward him through blood and ash. But here we are anyway. Cassian and the guards formed a defensive circle, their weapons drawn, their faces set. We made our choice, the general said. Same as you. Riker stared at them, at the people who'd just thrown away their lives to stand beside a king who'd already lost. And something in his chest cracked wide open, not his ribs, something deeper, the part of himself he'd kept locked away since his father's death, the part that remembered what it felt like to trust someone, to care about something other than survival. You're all insane, he said roughly. Probably. Celine stopped right in front of him, looked up at his transformed face without flinching. But I'd rather be insane with you than sane and alone. The words hung between them. Then the enemy charged. What happened next became the kind of story people told in whispers. Riker and Celine fought side by side, the Alpha King and the servant girl, Cassian and the guards forming a wall around them. They carved through Thane's forces like death itself had taken physical form. But the numbers were still wrong, still impossible. They were being pushed back, surrounded, cut off from the throne room and the last of the palace guard. This was the end. Riker knew it. Cassian knew it. Every soldier still standing knew it. They were going to die here in the streets of Nightbane while Thane's forces tore apart everything they'd tried to protect. Then something unexpected happened. The civilians attacked, not the trained fighters who'd answered the war bells during Maddox's assault. These were the people who'd hidden during the first battle, the merchants and craftsmen and families who'd cowered in basements while their city burned. Now they poured into the streets with whatever weapons they could find, kitchen knives, hammers. Broken furniture turned into clubs. They threw themselves at Thane's forces with the kind of desperate fury that came from watching your home get destroyed twice in one night. Riker saw a baker tackle a soldier 3 times his size, saw a woman with a baby strapped to her back drive a pitchfork through a warrior's chest, saw children throwing stones from rooftops while their parents fought in the streets below. It was chaos, madness. But it changed the tide. Thane's forces had been prepared to fight soldiers, had trained for organized resistance. They hadn't expected an entire city to rise up against them. The fighting intensified. Street by street, building by building, the battle devolved into brutal close-quarters combat, where training mattered less than pure determination. And the people of Nightbane were determined not to let their city fall. Riker fought his way toward the center of the enemy formation, toward the banner flying Thane's crimson wolf sigil. Because if he could kill the head, the body might fall. Celine stayed close, closer than she should have. Riker kept trying to push her back, kept trying to shield her with his own body, but she wouldn't stay behind him, wouldn't let him face this alone. They broke through the enemy line together, and there, surrounded by his personal guard, stood Lord Thane. The Western Lord was massive, nearly as large as Riker in hybrid form. His face was scarred from decades of war. His eyes held the cold calculation of a man who'd killed his way to power and maintained it through fear. He looked at Riker with something close to pity. You should have run, boy. Thane's voice was gravelly, deep. You could have lived, built something new somewhere else. Built it on what? Riker's claws dripped blood. Cowardice? The knowledge that I abandoned everyone who trusted me? Better than dying for pride. This isn't about pride. Riker gestured at the city fighting around them. This is about refusing to let men like you take everything from people who can't defend themselves. Thane laughed. You think you're a hero? You're a tyrant who got soft. Your father would be ashamed. My father was a monster. Riker's voice hardened. And I spent 15 years trying not to become him, trying to be better. But you know what I learned? What? Sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become something worse. Then Riker charged. The 2 alphas collided with the force of a thunderclap. Claws tore flesh, teeth snapped at throats. They moved so fast most observers only saw blurs of violence punctuated by sprays of blood. Thane was older, more experienced. He'd fought in wars that predated Riker's birth. But Riker was faster, angrier, fueled by the kind of rage that came from having nothing left to lose. They tore chunks out of each other, broke bones, opened wounds that would have killed normal men. Around them, the battle raged. Cassian led the palace guard in a desperate push to reach their king. Selene fought alongside civilians who barely knew which end of a sword to hold. The city was burning. People were dying. And at the center of it all, two kings fought for a crown that might not even matter anymore. Thane's claws caught Riker across the ribs. Bone cracked. Blood poured. But Riker didn't slow down. He drove his obsidian blade through Thane's chest, felt it punch through armor and muscle and the ancient heart beneath. The Western Lord's eyes went wide. "Impossible," he gasped. "The wound, silver-tipped. You should be dying?" Riker twisted the blade. "I am, but you're going first." Thane fell. His personal guard saw it happen, saw their lord collapse, saw the Alpha King standing over him covered in blood and burns and wounds that should have killed him hours ago. And they broke, just like Maddox's forces had broken. The army scattered, some surrendered. Most fled back toward the western territories. The battle was over. Riker swayed on his feet. The wolf was receding now, leaving him human again, leaving him with injuries that suddenly felt like they might actually be fatal. He looked around at the ruins of his capital. Buildings collapsed, bodies everywhere. The streets ran red with blood from both sides. This was victory. It felt like loss. Cassian appeared at his side, moving like every step hurt. "We won." "Did we?" Riker's voice was barely a whisper. "Look at what it cost." The general followed his gaze, saw the civilian casualties, saw the families searching through rubble for loved ones, saw the children crying over parents who weren't coming home. "Yeah," Cassian said quietly. "We won." Selene pushed through the crowd. Her dress was torn, blood matted her hair. But she was alive. She stopped in front of Riker and didn't say anything, didn't need to, because they both understood what had just happened. They'd survived. Against impossible odds. Against armies that should have crushed them. Against the simple mathematics of war. They'd survived. But the cost was written in every burning building and every broken body and every scream that still echoed through the morning air. Riker reached for her. His hand was shaking, covered in blood. More monster than man. Selene took it anyway. And for one brief moment, standing in the ruins of everything he'd built, Riker Voss allowed himself to feel something other than rage. Relief. Grief. The terrible understanding that victory and loss could occupy the same space. "We need to get you to the healers," Selene said softly. "You're bleeding everywhere." "So are you." "Then we'll go together." She helped him toward the palace. Cassian and the guards formed up around them. And the people of Nightbane watched their king limp through the streets he'd just defended. Some bowed, some just stared, but none of them looked away. Because Riker Voss had done something no Alpha King in living memory had ever done. He'd fought beside them instead of above them, had bled for them instead of demanding they bleed for him, had become human enough to be worth following. Oops. The throne room was a disaster. Part of the roof had collapsed during the siege. Rubble covered the obsidian floors. The black stone throne sat crooked on its dais like a drunk trying to stay upright. Riker stood in the center of the destruction and tried to process what came next. The city was barely standing. His armies were decimated. The noble houses that hadn't joined the rebellion were probably reconsidering their loyalty, and he was so tired he could barely stay on his feet. The healers had done what they could, cleaned his wounds, wrapped broken ribs, warned him that some of the injuries might never fully heal. Riker had thanked them and sent them away. Now he stood alone in the ruins of his throne room and tried to figure out how to rebuild an empire from ashes. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Selene entered through the broken eastern entrance. She'd cleaned up, changed clothes. The cut on her forehead had been properly bandaged. She looked almost normal. Almost. Except for her eyes. Those still held the weight of everything they'd witnessed. "I thought you were resting," Riker said. "Couldn't sleep." She moved closer. "Too much adrenaline, too many images I can't unsee." "I know the feeling." She stopped beside him and looked around at the destroyed throne room. "So what now?" The question hung in the air. What now indeed? Riker had spent his entire life building this empire, had fought and killed and sacrificed everything to maintain control. And in one night, all of it had nearly fallen apart. Because of her. Because he'd let himself care about something more than power. I rebuild, he said finally. The same way my father did after the clan wars. The same way every king before him did when their kingdoms burned. Alone? The word cut deeper than intended. Riker turned to look at her. Really look at her. At the woman who'd walked away and come back. Who'd rung the war bells. Who'd fought beside him when she should have been running. I don't know, he admitted. How do you rebuild with someone when your entire foundation is built on control and theirs is built on freedom? Celine was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that changed everything. Maybe you don't rebuild what was. Maybe you build something new. Meaning you spent 15 years trying to be your father, trying to rule through fear and dominance and absolute control. And it almost got you killed. His jaw tightened. So what's the alternative? Rule through kindness? Watch the kingdom fall apart because I'm too soft to make hard choices? No. Celine moved closer. Her voice was steady. Certain. Rule through balance. Find someone who challenges you when you go too far. Someone who reminds you that power without compassion is just tyranny wearing a crown. She was talking about herself. They both knew it. Riker's hands curled into fists. You're asking me to share power, to give up control. I'm asking you to trust. Her hand came up to rest against his chest. Right over the scars. To believe that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak. That caring about people doesn't automatically mean they'll betray you. Everyone betrays everyone eventually. It's just a matter of time. Then I'll betray you first. She met his eyes without flinching. I'll challenge every order you give that I think is wrong. I'll argue with you in front of your generals. I'll make you question yourself constantly. And if that's betrayal, then I'm guilty. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. Her voice softened. You meant that loving someone gives them power to destroy you. And you're right. It does. But here's the thing you never learned because your father beat it out of you. What? Sometimes being destroyed and rebuilt makes you stronger than you ever were alone. The words settled over him like a weight. Riker wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons why kings couldn't afford to be rebuilt, why showing weakness invited destruction, but he was so damn tired of being strong. What are you asking me? His voice came out rough, damaged. I'm asking you to try. Celine's hand stayed pressed against his chest. Just try to build something different, something that doesn't require you to be a monster to maintain it. And if I can't, if the monster is all I know how to be, then I'll remind you who you are underneath. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel her warmth, see the determination in her eyes. I'll be the mirror you're too afraid to look into. Riker closed his eyes, felt her heartbeat against his palm, felt the terror of letting someone this close, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Stay, he said quietly. Not as a servant, not as a possession. Stay as the thing I'm most afraid of. What's that? An equal. The words tasted foreign in his mouth. Someone who has power over me and chooses not to use it to destroy me. Celine was silent. When Riker opened his eyes, she was crying. Not from sadness, from relief. I need you to understand something, he continued. His voice was steady now. Certain. I'm going to fail at this. I'm going to revert to old patterns. Going to try to control you when I'm scared. Going to push you away when I feel vulnerable. I know. And you're still willing to try? Yes. She leaned into him. Let him wrap his arms around her. Because I've seen what you are when you're not trying to be your father. And that's the man worth fighting for. They stood there in the ruins of the throne room. Two broken people holding on to each other like the other was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to ash. Outside, the city began the long process of rebuilding. Inside, a king learned what it meant to surrender. Des Sauts. 3 days later, Riker called a council. Not the old council. Most of those nobles were dead or scattered. This was different. He gathered the survivors, the generals who'd stayed loyal, the civilians who'd fought in the streets, even a few of the merchants whose businesses had been destroyed. They assembled in what was left of the Great Hall. Riker stood before them without his crown, without his armor, just a man in simple clothes with bandages showing beneath his sleeves. You all fought for this city, he began. His voice carried across the room. You bled for it, lost people you loved defending it. And I want you to understand something. The room was silent. This is your city now, not mine, yours. The Black Dominion survived because you refused to let it fall, because you stood up when you could have run, because you chose to fight for your homes instead of waiting for a king to save you. Murmurs spread through the crowd. So here's what's going to change. Riker's eyes swept across the assembled people. No more rule by decree. No more decisions made behind closed doors by nobles who've never walked your streets. From now on, this council represents you, your voices, your needs. A merchant stood up. His face was scarred from the fighting. You're giving up power? I'm sharing it. Riker met his gaze. Because power concentrated in one person's hands created this mess. Created a system where rebellion was the only option for people who felt unheard. What about the noble houses? Someone called out. They'll never accept this. Then they can leave. Riker's voice hardened. Any house that can adapt to a kingdom where common voices matter is welcome to find another land to rule. This is the Black Dominion. And Dominion means all of us, not just the alphas who happen to be born with fangs. The room exploded into conversation. Arguments, questions, confusion. Cassian appeared at Riker's side. You're sure about this? Dismantling the entire power structure? No. Riker watched the chaos he'd just created, but I'm sure continuing the old way leads to more rebellions, more wars, more nights like the one we just survived. The general nodded slowly. Then I'm with you. Even if it fails, especially then. Cassian's expression was grim. I'd rather go down trying something new than succeed at maintaining a system that requires constant bloodshed. They spent the next 4 hours hammering out details. Who would represent which districts? How decisions would be made? What happened when the council and the king disagreed? It was messy, imperfect, but it was something. When the meeting finally ended, Riker found Celine waiting outside the Great Hall. How'd it go? She asked. About as well as expected. He rubbed his eyes. Half of them think I've lost my mind. The other half think I'm trying to trick them into complacency before I seize all the power back. Are you? No. He met her gaze. But I understand why they'd think that. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. She took his hand. Then we have time. Do we? Riker looked at the city beyond the palace walls. How long before the next ambitious lord decides a weak king is better than a reformed one? How long before someone else marches an army toward Nightbane? Then we fight again. Her grip tightened. And again. And again. Until they understand this is permanent, or until I'm dead and someone else takes the throne. Then make sure whoever comes after you believes in what you're building. She pulled him closer. Make sure your legacy isn't just the empire you conquered. Make sure it's the system you created that could survive without you. The words hit harder than expected. Because that was the thing, wasn't it? Riker had spent his entire reign making himself essential, making sure the kingdom couldn't function without his iron grip. Now he was trying to build something that didn't need him at all. It went against every instinct, every lesson his father had taught. But maybe that was the point. Maybe being a good king meant creating something that could outlive you, even if it meant admitting you weren't irreplaceable. They walked through the palace gardens. Most of the flowers had been trampled during the fighting, but a few had survived, small patches of color against the ash and destruction. Celine stopped beside a rose bush that was somehow still blooming. I need to tell you something, she said quietly. Riker waited. Kyle left the city. She wouldn't look at him. After I rode back during the battle, he waited at the gates for 3 days, hoping I'd come back to him. When I didn't, he just left. And how do you feel about that? Guilty. She touched one of the roses gently. He was a good man. Didn't deserve to get caught in the middle of this. No. He didn't. Riker moved closer. If you want to go after him, I don't. Celine finally looked up. I made my choice. Made it when I came back. Made it again when I stayed. Kyle deserves someone who chooses him without reservation. That's not me. Because of me. Because of us, she corrected. Because whatever this is between us, it's not simple. It's not easy. But it's real in a way that safe and simple never was. Riker reached out slowly, gave her time to pull away. She didn't. His hand cupped her face gently. You could still have simple. Could still walk away and build the normal life you wanted. I know. Her hand covered his. But I don't want normal anymore. I want this. Want you. Want the impossible task of trying to save a king from himself while saving myself from getting lost in him. That's not a happy ending. Maybe not. She smiled slightly. But it's an honest one. They kissed. Not the violent, desperate kind from before. This was softer. Slower. The kind of kiss that acknowledged all the broken pieces and chose to hold them anyway. When they pulled apart, Riker rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to hurt you, he said quietly. Going to make mistakes and push too hard and revert to controlling everything when I'm scared. I know. And you're still choosing this? Yes. Her eyes stayed locked on his. Because I'd rather fight through the hard parts with you than coast through the easy parts with someone else. The admission settled between them. Final. Irrevocable. The point of no return they'd both been circling for months. Then we do this together. Riker's voice was steady. No more sending you away to keep you safe. No more making decisions for you. We face whatever comes next side by side. Even if it kills us? Especially then. Celine nodded. And in that moment, standing in a garden barely clinging to life, Riker Voss finally understood what his father had never taught him. That the strongest bonds weren't forged through dominance. They were forged through choice, through two people deciding every single day that the work of loving someone broken was worth it. That rebuilding together was harder than ruling alone, but infinitely more real. The sun was setting over Nightbane, painting the ruins in shades of gold and shadow. And for the first time since taking the crown, Riker looked at his kingdom and saw a possibility instead of territory to control. Saw people instead of subjects. Saw a future that might actually be worth the fight. Behind him, the palace stood damaged but still standing. Ahead of him, the work of rebuilding an empire from the ground up. Beside him, the woman who'd chosen to stay when staying meant war. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, that was enough. The first 3 weeks after the siege felt like walking through a dream that hadn't quite solidified into reality. Riker watched his kingdom begin the slow process of healing, watched workers clear rubble from the streets, watched families rebuild homes that had been standing for generations before fire consumed them, watched the new council argue and compromise and slowly figure out how to govern without a tyrant making every decision. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like waiting for the other shoe to drop, because power never surrendered quietly, never retreated without plotting its return. And Riker had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous attacks came from the people you trusted most. He stood in the war room studying maps of the surrounding territories. Intelligence reports covered the table. Scouts had been tracking movement along the borders for days now. Small armies gathering, noble houses meeting in secret, the kind of activity that preceded either alliance or invasion. Cassian entered without knocking. The general looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. Fresh scars from the siege still healing. Eastern lords are mobilizing, he said without preamble. At least 4 houses. Maybe 6 if the reports from the mountain passes are accurate. Already, Riker didn't look up from the maps. We just finished burying the dead from the last rebellion. They see weakness. Cassian moved to stand beside him. A king who shares power, who listens to common voices. To them, that's the same as surrender. Let them think what they want. Riker traced the border with one finger. How long until they move? 2 weeks. Maybe 3. They're being careful this time. Learning from Maddox and Thane's mistakes. Meaning they won't attack until they're certain they can win. Exactly. The door opened again. Celine entered carrying a stack of documents. She'd taken on an unofficial role as liaison between the council and the throne. Someone who could translate between the language of power and the language of survival. She looked between Riker and Cassian. More bad news? When is it ever good news? Riker gestured to the maps. The eastern houses are preparing to move against us. Celine set the documents down and studied the intelligence reports. Her eyes moved quickly across the text. Reading, processing. She'd gotten better at this over the past weeks. Better at understanding the brutal calculus of politics and war. What if we offered them terms? She asked. Showed them the changes we're making. Proved that sharing power doesn't mean weakness. They don't want terms. Cassian's voice was flat. They want the old system back. Want a king who rules through fear. Want everything to return to the way it was before we decided to reinvent how empires work. Then they're going to be disappointed. Riker finally looked up from the maps. Because I'm not going back to being my father. Even if it costs you the kingdom? The question hung in the air. It was the central tension that had defined every decision for the past 3 weeks. How much was Riker willing to sacrifice to maintain the changes he'd started? How far would he go to protect a system that might not survive its first real test? Yes, he said quietly. Even then. Celine's hand found his, squeezed gently. Cassian nodded slowly. Then we prepare for war. Again. The general left to coordinate defenses. Riker and Celine stood alone in the war room surrounded by maps that showed how small their empire had become, how fragile their hold on power. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "About risking everything for changes that might not work?" "No." He pulled her closer. "I'm not sure about anything anymore. But I know going back to the old ways leads to the same cycle. Rebellion, suppression, more death. Eventually someone wins and the whole thing starts over. So you're choosing to break the cycle even if it breaks you. Someone has to." Riker looked at the maps again. Saw the territories that used to bow to his name. Saw them preparing to tear his kingdom apart. Maybe it won't work. Maybe we'll lose everything trying to build something better. But at least we'll lose trying instead of maintaining something rotten. Celine was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made his chest tighten. "I'm proud of you." The words were so unexpected that Riker almost didn't know how to respond, because no one had ever said that to him before. His father certainly hadn't. The old king had viewed pride as weakness, had beaten any desire for approval out of Riker before he'd even understood what he was losing. "Don't be," Riker said roughly. "Not yet. Pride comes after we survive what's coming. Then I'll be proud of you for trying." Her hand came up to touch his face, "For choosing to be something other than what you were raised to be." He kissed her, hard, desperate, like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath his feet. When they pulled apart, Celine's eyes were bright. "We should check on the council. They're voting on resource allocation today." Riker nodded and followed her out of the war room. Neither of them noticed the shadow that moved in the corridor outside. Watching, waiting, planning. The council chamber had been relocated to what used to be the Eastern Ballroom. The throne room was still under repair, would be for months. Riker entered to find the representatives already assembled, merchants beside generals, craftsmen beside minor nobles who'd stayed loyal. It was a strange mix, the kind that shouldn't work but somehow did. He took his seat at the head of the table. Not a throne, just a chair, same as everyone else. The gesture was deliberate, symbolic. Some of the nobles still hated it. The vote proceeded smoothly enough. Arguments about funding for rebuilding versus strengthening defenses. The same tensions that had defined every session. Riker mostly listened, let them debate. Only intervened when the conversation threatened to spiral into deadlock. This was the hard part of shared power, letting other people make decisions he might not agree with, trusting that collective wisdom might actually be better than singular control. It went against every instinct, but he was learning, slowly, painfully. The session was almost over when one of the generals stood up. Marcus Grieve, a veteran who'd served under Riker's father. Old school, traditional, the kind of soldier who believed in chain of command and absolute authority. "My king," Marcus began. His tone was carefully respectful. "I have a concern. Speak." These reforms we're implementing. Sharing power with the council. Giving common voices equal weight. It's admirable in theory. Riker's jaw tightened. He recognized that tone. The precursor to criticism wrapped in false praise. "But in practice," he prompted, "in practice it makes us vulnerable." Marcus gestured around the table. The Eastern houses are mobilizing because they see weakness. They see a king who questions himself, who hesitates, who allows himself to be challenged by people with no understanding of military strategy or political reality. The room went quiet. "Those people you're dismissing," Celine said from her position beside Riker, "defended this city when your fellow generals were ready to abandon it." Marcus didn't even look at her. "With respect, you're exactly what I'm talking about. A servant girl with no training advising the king on matters of state. It's unprecedented. Inappropriate. Careful, General. Riker's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You're close to a line you don't want to cross. I'm simply stating what many are thinking but are too afraid to say. Marcus met his eyes without flinching. You've changed, my king, and not for the better. The man who unified the clans wouldn't have tolerated this chaos, wouldn't have shared power, wouldn't have let sentiment compromise his judgment. Sentiment. Riker stood slowly. Is that what you call it when a king listens to the people he's supposed to protect? I call it weakness. Marcus's voice hardened. Your father would have crushed this rebellion before it started, would have executed anyone who questioned his authority, would have ruled through strength instead of this experiment in democracy that will get us all killed. The words landed like a slap. Because part of Riker wondered if the general was right, if all these changes were just elaborate self-destruction disguised as progress. My father, Riker said quietly, died choking on poisoned wine because he was so busy controlling everything that he never noticed the knife coming from inside his own court. So forgive me if I don't take his methods as gospel. Better to die maintaining order than live watching it fall apart. Then you should leave. Riker's voice was ice now. Because this is the order we're building, and if you can't accept that, there's the door. Marcus stared at him. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the expression of a man who'd been waiting for this moment. As you command, my king. The general bowed with exaggerated formality. I'll gather my things. He left. The room erupted in whispers. Cassian appeared at Riker's side. That was a mistake. What? Letting him walk away? Not stopping him. The general's expression was grim. Marcus has been with us for 20 years. Commands the loyalty of at least a third of the standing army. And you just publicly humiliated him. He humiliated himself. Riker sat back down. I'm not going to tolerate insubordination just because someone has seniority. This isn't about seniority. Cassian leaned closer, lowered his voice. This is about optics. You just proved his point, showed everyone in this room that questioning you gets you exiled. The observation stung because it was accurate. Riker had been trying so hard to be different from his father that he'd walked right into acting exactly like him. The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. People were more careful with their words, more hesitant to challenge. The exact opposite of what Riker had been trying to build. When the session finally ended, he retreated to his private chambers with Celine. She waited until they were alone before speaking. Marcus was testing you, she said, seeing if you'd revert to old patterns under pressure. And I failed. Riker poured himself a drink, hands shaking slightly. Proved I'm still the tyrant wearing a reformer's mask. You made a mistake. That's different from being a tyrant, is it? He downed the drink in one swallow. Because from where I'm standing, the line between the two gets thinner every day. Celine moved closer, took the glass from his hand. Then learn from it. Apologize if you need to. Show the council that even kings can admit when they're wrong. The suggestion was radical. Kings didn't apologize, didn't admit mistakes. That was weakness, vulnerability, the kind of thing that invited challenges. But maybe that was the point. Maybe being vulnerable was exactly what this new system required. Before Riker could respond, someone knocked urgently on the door. Cassian entered without waiting for permission. His face was pale. We have a problem. Riker's stomach dropped. What now? Marcus didn't leave. The general's voice was tight. He went straight to the barracks and started talking to the troops. By the time my people realized what was happening, half the garrison was listening. Listening to what? Cassian pulled out a letter, handed it to Riker. The words on the page made his blood run cold. It was a call to arms. A declaration that the true king had been corrupted by foreign influence, that the reforms were a betrayal of everything the Black Dominion stood for, that loyal soldiers had a duty to restore order. And at the bottom, 3 signatures. Marcus Grieve, 2 other senior generals Riker had trusted for years. This is treason, Celine whispered. This is a coup, Cassian corrected. And it's happening right now. As if to punctuate the statement, alarm bells began ringing throughout the palace, the sound that meant the inner guard was under attack. Riker moved to the window, looked down at the courtyard below. What he saw made his heart stop. Palace guards fighting each other. Soldiers loyal to him clashing with soldiers loyal to Marcus. The coup wasn't coming from outside the walls. It was already inside. How many? His voice was eerily calm. At least 2,000 troops have sided with Marcus. Cassian's hand was on his sword. Maybe more. They control the eastern barracks and the armory. And our forces? Scattered, confused. Most don't know who to follow. This was the nightmare scenario. The thing every ruler feared more than external invasion. Civil war within his own guard. We need to get you somewhere safe, Cassian said. There are tunnels beneath the palace. We can evacuate you and Selene before they breach the inner keep. No! Riker turned from the window. If I run now, I lose everything. Every soldier still loyal will think I abandoned them. Then what do you want to do? End this, quickly, before it spreads beyond the palace walls. Riker moved to his weapons cabinet, started strapping on armor, the obsidian blade, the silver gauntlets his father had worn. Selene grabbed his arm. This is what Marcus wants. Wants you to come down there and fight. Wants to prove you're still the violent king who solves everything with bloodshed. Then he's about to get exactly what he wants. Riker's eyes were cold now, silver, the wolf rising. Because I can be a reformer who believes in shared power, can listen to counsels and compromise and try to build something better. But I'm still the Alpha King, and anyone who forgets that learns the lesson in blood. The transformation was terrifying to witness, because this was the Riker that Selene had been afraid of, the monster beneath the man. The creature that had built an empire on violence and maintained it through fear. He was choosing to be that monster again, not because he wanted to, but because the alternative was watching everything burn. Cassian nodded grimly. Then we fight. They left the chambers and headed toward the courtyard. The palace was chaos. Guards running in every direction, servants hiding in alcoves, the sound of steel on steel echoing through stone corridors. Riker moved through it all like a force of nature. Any soldier who moved against him died. Fast, brutal, no hesitation. This wasn't the measured combat of the siege. This was execution. Riker cutting through his own men with the kind of efficiency that came from decades of practice. Selene followed close behind. She'd grabbed a blade from somewhere. Didn't know how to use it properly, but held it anyway. They reached the main courtyard to find Marcus commanding from the center. 200 troops surrounded him, all armed, all watching Riker emerge from the palace entrance. The fighting stopped. Everyone turned to watch. Because this was the moment that would decide everything. The king facing his general, the reformer confronting the traditionalist, the new way clashing with the old. Marcus stepped forward, blood splattered across his armor. Not his own. I gave you a chance to do this quietly, he called out. Could have stepped aside, retired with dignity. Let someone stronger take the throne. Stronger? Riker's voice carried across the courtyard. You think betraying your oath makes you strong? I think maintaining order makes me a realist. Marcus drew his sword. You've gone soft, Riker. Let that girl poison your mind with ideas about equality and shared power. Our enemies see it. Our allies see it. I'm doing what needs to be done. By tearing apart the kingdom from inside? By saving it from your weakness. The general attacked. Fast. Professional. The kind of assault that came from years of training and absolute certainty. Riker met him head on. Their blades clashed with a sound like thunder. The two men circled each other while every soldier in the courtyard watched. This wasn't just combat. It was a trial. The old way fighting the new. Tradition battling progress. Two visions of what the Black Dominion should be meeting in violence. Marcus was good. Better than good. He'd fought in wars before Riker was born. Had killed hundreds of enemies. Had earned his rank through blood and skill. But Riker was the Alpha King. And when the wolf fully emerged, generals became prey. The fight was over in less than a minute. Riker's blade punched through Marcus's chest, straight through the heart. The general's eyes went wide, shocked, like he genuinely believed he could win. You were right about one thing, Riker said quietly. Only the general could hear him now. I did go soft. Started believing I could be something other than the monster my father created. But you just reminded me why that's dangerous. Marcus coughed blood. This changes nothing. You're wrong. Riker pulled the blade free. Let the general fall. This changes everything. He turned to face the troops who'd followed Marcus. They stood frozen, uncertain, because their leader was dead, and the king they'd tried to overthrow was still standing, covered in blood, eyes burning silver, very much the monster they'd forgotten he could be. Anyone else want to test whether I've gone too soft? Riker's voice was cold, empty. Come on, I'll fight every single one of you right now. No one moved. The coup was over. But as Riker looked at the faces of his own soldiers, at the fear in their eyes, he realized something terrible. He'd just won by becoming exactly what he'd been trying not to be. Had proven Marcus's point even while killing him for it. Cassian appeared at his side. The palace is secure. Most of Marcus's supporters surrendered once they saw him fall. And the ones who didn't? Dead. The general's voice was flat. All of them. Riker looked around the courtyard, at the bodies of men who'd served him yesterday, who'd fought beside him during the siege, who'd been loyal right up until they decided he'd changed too much. Get them buried, he said quietly. With honor. They were traitors, but they were our traitors. Cassian nodded and started issuing orders. Celine approached slowly. She was shaking. Whether from fear or adrenaline, Riker couldn't tell. You didn't have a choice, she said. Her voice was steady despite the trembling. He forced your hand. Did he? Riker looked at Marcus's body. Or did I just prove that all my talk about change was a lie? That the moment someone pushes back, I revert to solving problems with violence? You defended yourself. I slaughtered my own men. He met her eyes. Don't try to pretty it up. Don't make it into something noble. This is who I am when I'm cornered. This is what I do. Then maybe who you are is complicated. Celine stepped closer. Maybe you can be both the reformer and the monster. Maybe that's what it takes to survive. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like a death sentence. Because if being both was the only way to survive, then Riker would spend the rest of his life trapped between two identities, never fully one or the other, always fighting himself as much as his enemies. The alarm bells finally stopped ringing. The courtyard fell silent except for the sound of bodies being moved and wounded being treated. Riker stood in the center of it all and felt something inside him crack, not break, just shift. Like tectonic plates grinding against each other, changing the landscape, creating something new from the collision. He'd wanted to be different, had tried so hard to be better than his father. But maybe the truth was simpler and crueler than that. Maybe some people were just meant to rule through fear, even when they desperately wanted to be loved instead. Poems. The council met the next morning in emergency session. Every representative looked shaken. They'd all heard about the coup, about the bodies in the courtyard, about the king standing over his dead general like something out of nightmare. Riker entered the chamber and felt the shift immediately. They were afraid of him again. Not the cautious respect of the past weeks. Real fear. The kind that came from remembering what he was capable of when pushed. He took a seat at the head of the table. No one spoke. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, one of the merchants found his voice. My king, we're relieved you survived. Are you? Riker's tone was neutral. Or are you wondering if the man who killed his own general for challenging him is going to start executing council members who disagree with his decisions? The merchant's face went pale. That's what I thought. Riker looked around the table. Let me be very clear about something. What happened yesterday was treason. Marcus Grieve attempted a coup. He died for it. That's not tyranny. That's consequence. Of course, someone murmured. Everyone else nodded quickly. But here's what you're all really thinking. Riker leaned forward. You're thinking that maybe Marcus was right, that maybe these reforms are making the kingdom weak, that maybe a king who has to fight off rebellions every few weeks isn't strong enough to hold power. No one contradicted him, because they were thinking exactly that. Riker could see it in their faces, the doubt, the uncertainty, the growing belief that returning to the old ways might be safer than gambling on untested changes. So let's address it directly. He stood, walked around the table slowly. Do you want me to go back to ruling like my father? Want me to make every decision without input? Want me to execute anyone who questions my authority? The room was silent, still. No, Celine said quietly from her position against the wall. That's not what anyone wants, isn't it? Riker stopped in front of the merchant who'd spoken earlier. Because I can do that, can become the tyrant you're all secretly hoping for, the one who makes you feel safe because at least you know where you stand. My king, that's not... Don't lie to me. Riker's voice was sharp. I can smell fear, can hear your heart racing. You're terrified right now. And part of you thinks that terror is appropriate, that kings should be feared, that fear is what keeps kingdoms stable. He moved to the next council member, a craftsman who'd fought in the streets during the siege. You risked your life defending this city, Riker said. Fought beside soldiers and nobles and people you'd never met because you believed your home was worth saving. And now you're sitting here wondering if trusting me was a mistake. The craftsman wouldn't meet his eyes. Riker completed the circuit of the table, returned to his seat. Here's the truth, he said. His voice was quieter now. Tired. I don't know if these reforms will work. Don't know if sharing power makes us stronger or just creates more targets for our enemies. Don't know if I can be both the monster who survives and the man who deserves to. Someone shifted uncomfortably. But I know this. Riker met each person's eyes in turn. Going back to the old system guarantees we end up in the same cycle. Rebellion, suppression, violence. Eventually this kingdom tears itself apart because the only language we speak is force. Then what do you propose? One of the nobles asked carefully. We keep trying. Riker's jaw tightened. We figure out how to balance strength with flexibility. How to defend ourselves without becoming the thing we're defending against. How to build something that survives me instead of something that requires me. And if we fail, then at least we fail trying to be better instead of succeeding at being exactly what we've always been. The words settled over the room. Slowly, the craftsman who'd fought in the siege raised his hand. I'm with you, he said. His voice was rough, uncertain, but committed. Whatever happens, I'm with you. One by one, others echoed the sentiment. Not everyone. Some stayed silent, some looked doubtful, but enough spoke up that Riker felt something he hadn't felt in days. Hope. Fragile. Tentative. But real. The session continued. They discussed reinforcing defenses, preparing for the inevitable assault from the eastern houses, coordinating food distribution to districts still recovering from the siege, normal governance, messy, imperfect, but functional. When the meeting finally ended, Cassian pulled Riker aside. We need to talk about the army, the general said. His expression was grim. Marcus's coup split the garrison. Even the soldiers who stayed loyal are questioning themselves now, wondering if they backed the wrong side. How bad is it? Bad enough that I don't trust half of them in a real fight. Cassian lowered his voice. We need to make an example. Show everyone what happens to traitors. Restore discipline through fear if we have to. No. Riker shook his head. That's exactly what Marcus wanted. Wanted me to become the tyrant, to prove his point even in death. Then what do you want to do? Because right now, we have an army that doesn't trust itself and enemies gathering at our borders. We need unity. Fast. Then we earn it. Riker's voice was firm. We show them through action instead of punishment. We lead from the front when the eastern houses attack. We bleed alongside them instead of ordering them to bleed for us. That's a risk. Everything's a risk. Riker met his general's eyes. But I'd rather risk dying beside my troops than live ruling through fear. Cassian nodded slowly. Then we prepare for war. Again. Again. The word had become a refrain, a constant reminder that peace was temporary, that victory just meant surviving long enough to face the next threat. Riker was so tired of war, but war was the only language the world seemed to understand. Well, that night, Riker stood on the eastern wall watching the horizon. Somewhere out there, armies were gathering, houses plotting, enemies preparing to finish what Maddox and Thane and Marcus had started. The cycle continued, and Riker was trapped in it. Footsteps approached from behind. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Celine stood beside him, silent for a long moment. You're thinking about running, she finally said. How can you tell? Because you get this look. Like you're calculating how far you could go before someone caught you. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. I could take you with me, Riker said. His voice was barely a whisper. Could leave tonight, disappear into the territories beyond the mountains. Let someone else deal with rebellions and councils and the impossible task of reforming an empire that doesn't want to change. You could. Celine's hand found his. But you won't. Why not? Because you're not your father. And your father would have run, would have abandoned everything the moment it got difficult, would have saved himself and let the kingdom burn. Riker laughed bitterly. You have a lot more faith in me than I deserve. Maybe. She leaned against him. Or maybe I just see who you are beneath all the doubt and self-loathing. And who is that? Someone who keeps trying even when trying costs everything. Someone who makes mistakes but owns them. Someone who's terrified of becoming a monster but fights it anyway. The words were meant to be comforting. Instead, they felt like a cage. Because Celine was describing someone Riker wasn't sure he could be. Someone who existed more in her imagination than in reality. What if I can't live up to that, he asked. What if the next time I'm cornered, I don't just kill one general? What if I become the thing my father was and I can't find my way back? Then I'll remind you, her voice was steady. I'll be the mirror you're too afraid to look into. We'll show you who you are when you forget. And if that's not enough, then we fail together. She turned to face him fully. But at least we fail trying instead of surrendering to what we're afraid of becoming. Riker pulled her close, held her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to humanity. Around them, the city slept fitfully. Guards patrolled the walls, workers prepared for the next assault. Life continued in that fragile space between wars. And Riker Voss made a decision. Not a grand one. Not some dramatic declaration. Just a simple choice to keep trying. To face whatever came next. To be both the monster who survived and the man who wanted to be better. Even if it killed him. Especially if it killed him. Because the alternative was becoming his father. And that was a fate worse than death. Dawn came 3 days later with scouts riding hard toward the palace. Riker met them at the gates, Cassian already there, both men knowing what the news would be before the scouts spoke. Eastern houses are moving, the lead scout gasped, breathing hard. 6 armies, combined force of 30,000 troops. They'll reach the border in 2 days. 30,000, against what remained of Riker's forces after the coup and the siege. The numbers were impossible. How certain are you? Cassian asked. Saw them myself. The scout's face was pale. They're not hiding, not even trying. They want us to see them coming. Because they want us to run, Riker said quietly. Want us to evacuate or surrender before they arrive. Want to take the capital without a fight. Can we hold? Cassian's voice was measured. Careful. Not a chance. Riker stared at the horizon. Not with the garrison split and our defenses still damaged from the last assault. This isn't a battle we can win through courage or strategy. The math doesn't work. Then what do we do? The question hung in the air. Around them, guards were gathering, listening, waiting for their king to perform another miracle, to pull victory from certain defeat like he'd done during the siege. But Riker was fresh out of miracles. He'd built this kingdom on violence, had maintained it through fear, had tried to reform it through hope, and now it was all crashing down anyway. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. Riker looked at Cassian, at Celine who'd appeared from somewhere, at the guards and soldiers and people who'd trusted him to know what to do. And he realized something terrible. There was only one move left, the kind of move that changed everything. The kind that required him to become something he'd spent months trying not to be. Assemble the council, he said. His voice was cold now. Empty. Everyone. Right now. Cassian hesitated. Riker. Now. The general left. Celine moved closer. What are you planning? The only thing I can. Riker's hands curled into fists, the thing I should have done from the beginning instead of pretending I could be anything other than what I was raised to be. You're scaring me. Good. He met her eyes. You should be scared, because what I'm about to do either saves everyone or destroys everything, and I won't know which until it's too late to take it back. The council assembled within the hour. Every representative, every general, every person who'd been part of the experiment in shared governance. They filled the chamber and waited. Riker stood before them and felt the weight of what he was about to do. The Eastern armies will be here in 2 days, he began. 30,000 troops against our 5,000 fit to fight. We cannot win this battle through conventional means. Then we negotiate, someone suggested. Offer terms before they reach the walls. They don't want terms. Riker's voice was flat. They want capitulation, want the old system restored, want me dead and someone more traditional on the throne. Then what do you propose? I propose we give them exactly what they want. The room erupted, protests, confusion, demands for clarification. Riker waited for the noise to die down. Then he explained the most dangerous gamble of his life, the plan that would either save his kingdom or destroy it completely, the choice that would transform him into something none of them recognized. And when he finished speaking, the council sat in stunned silence. Because Riker Voss had just proposed becoming the exact thing he'd spent his entire reign trying not to be. The monster. Pure, complete, unstoppable. The thing his father had tried to create. And this time, there would be no coming back. The silence in the council chamber was absolute. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. They just stared at Riker like he'd proposed burning the entire kingdom to ash and starting over from nothing. Which, in a way, he had. You want to what? The merchant's voice came out as a whisper, strangled, disbelieving. Riker remained standing. His posture was rigid, controlled. The kind of control that came right before violence. You heard me. His voice was flat, empty of emotion. I'm going to meet them on the plains, alone. No army, no guard, just me and whatever's left of the wolf my father tried to beat into submission. That's suicide. Cassian stood abruptly, his chair scraped against stone. My king, you can't seriously... I can, and I will. Riker's eyes were already changing, silver bleeding into the irises, the wolf pushing closer to the surface. They want the old king back? The monster who ruled through fear? I'll give them exactly that. We'll show every house in the Eastern Territories what happens when you mistake reform for weakness. This isn't reform. Celine's voice cut through the room like a blade. This is regression. This is you becoming your father. No. Riker turned to face her. His expression was cold, distant. My father would have sent armies, would have crushed the rebellion from a distance and called it strategy. I'm going to meet them face to face, going to give them one chance to turn back before I become the nightmare they've forgotten I can be. One man against 30,000? A general shook his head. You'll last 5 minutes. Then it will be a memorable 5 minutes. The words landed like stones in deep water. Because everyone in that room understood what Riker was really saying. This wasn't about winning. It was about sending a message. About making the cost of rebellion so catastrophically high that no one would dare try again. It was about becoming the thing he'd spent months running from. The monster. Pure and absolute and terrifying. And here's the brutal truth about monsters that most people never understand. They're not born from cruelty or madness or some inherent evil. They're born from necessity. From the moment when every other option has been stripped away and the only thing left is deciding whether you'll die quietly or take everyone with you. Riker had spent his entire reign trying to be something other than what his father created. Had genuinely believed that compassion and shared power could replace dominance and fear. But the world doesn't reward compassion. It punishes it, exploits it, uses it as a weapon against the people foolish enough to believe mercy matters more than strength. There has to be another way. Celine moved closer. Her hands were shaking. We can evacuate, regroup in the Western Territories, build support, and come back stronger. And abandon everyone who can't run fast enough? Riker's voice was ice. The families still rebuilding homes? The people who fought in the streets because they believed this city was worth defending? You want me to leave them to whatever mercy the Eastern houses decide to show? Better than dying for nothing. I'm not dying for nothing. He finally looked at her. Really looked at her. Saw the fear in her eyes. The desperate hope that he'd change his mind. I'm dying so that what we started here doesn't die with me. So that the idea of a different kind of kingdom survives even if I don't. Ideas don't need martyrs. Celine's voice broke. They need people alive to fight for them. Wrong. Riker moved past her toward the door. Ideas need proof. Need someone willing to show that some things are worth more than survival. And right now, the only thing standing between this kingdom and total collapse is fear. Fear of what happens when you push me too far. He stopped at the threshold. Looked back at the assembled council one last time. Here's what happens next. His voice carried absolute authority now. The kind that made people straighten unconsciously. Cassian, you evacuate anyone who wants to leave. Use the mountain passes. Get them somewhere safe before the Eastern armies arrive. And if they don't want to leave, then they stay and hope I'm as scary as my reputation suggests. My king, Cassian started. That's an order, General, not a discussion. The general's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Riker's gaze swept across the rest of the council. You wanted a different kind of ruler? Wanted someone who listened and compromised and shared power? You got that. For 3 weeks, you saw what that looked like. Now you're about to see what happens when that ruler decides the only way to protect what you built together is to become the thing he was trying not to be. This is madness, someone whispered. Probably. Riker's expression didn't change, but it's the only madness we have left. He left before anyone could argue further. The council erupted behind him, voices raised in protest and confusion and the beginning of panic. Riker didn't look back, couldn't look back, because if he did, he'd see Celine's face, would see the heartbreak there, would remember that he'd promised to be better than this. And promises meant nothing when everyone you cared about was about to be slaughtered. The corridor outside was empty, quiet. Riker walked through stone halls he'd known his entire life, past paintings of previous kings, past windows overlooking a city that had nearly burned twice in the span of a month. This was his legacy: violence and ash, and the desperate attempt to be something other than what he was bred to be. The attempt had failed. Now came the reckoning. His chambers were exactly as he'd left them. Weapons mounted on walls, maps spread across tables. The obsidian blade resting in its stand near the window. Riker moved to the weapon, lifted it, felt the familiar weight settle into his grip. His father's blade, the one that had killed the previous king. The one that had maintained order through 3 decades of brutal rule. The one Riker had sworn he'd never wield the way his father had. Oaths meant nothing when survival was the only option left. He strapped on armor next. Not the ceremonial kind worn for councils and appearances. The real armor. Battle-scarred. Functional. Designed to keep you alive long enough to kill everything in reach. His hands moved automatically. Muscle memory from years of preparing for war. Because that's what alphas did. They fought. They killed. They maintained power through dominance and fear and the absolute certainty that challenging them meant death. Riker had tried to be different, had genuinely believed he could break the cycle. But cycles existed for a reason. And the reason was simple and cruel and absolute. Some people were just meant to be monsters. Some people were forged in violence, and no amount of reformation could change the fundamental truth of what they were. Riker's father had understood this, had spent years beating that lesson into his son until it became bone-deep knowledge. You could dress a wolf in silk, could teach it to sit at tables and speak with nobles, could surround it with symbols of civilization. But underneath, it was still a wolf, still had teeth, still remembered what blood tasted like. And when the silk was torn away and the pretense of civilization collapsed, the wolf didn't hesitate. It didn't mourn what it had lost. It simply became what it had always been. The door opened behind him. He didn't turn around. Already knew who it was. Celine's footsteps were soft against stone. She stopped a few feet away. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of conversation. "You're really doing this." Her voice was steady, despite the tears he could hear beneath it. "Yes, even though it means becoming exactly what you were afraid of, especially because of that." Riker finally turned to face her, saw her standing there with red eyes and clenched fists. "You were right about me from the beginning. I'm not capable of being the man you thought I could be. Not when the cost is everyone I'm supposed to protect. That's not what I said. It's what you meant." He moved closer, stopped just within reach. "You saw the monster underneath and hoped the man could win. But monsters don't lose, Celine Partsimanis. They just pretend to be human for a while before circumstances force them back into their true nature. Then I was wrong about you." She met his eyes without flinching. "Because the Riker I know wouldn't give up this easily. Wouldn't surrender to what he's afraid of becoming. I'm not surrendering. I'm accepting reality. Reality is that you have choices." Her voice rose slightly. "You can evacuate with us, can build support in other territories, can find a way to fight that doesn't require you to sacrifice everything you've become. There is no everything I've become." Riker's hands curled into fists. "There's just what I've always been underneath the delusion that I could be better. My father saw it. Marcus saw it. Every enemy who's ever challenged me saw it. The only person who couldn't see it was you. The words were designed to hurt, to push her away, to make the leaving easier. But Celine didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped closer. Her hand came up to rest against his chest, right over his heart, where the rhythm was too fast, too erratic. You're lying. Her voice was quiet now. Certain. You're lying to me and yourself because you think it'll be easier if I hate you. If I believe you're just another tyrant who couldn't escape his nature. But I can feel your heart racing, can see the fear in your eyes. This isn't acceptance, this is terror. The accuracy of the observation cracked something inside him. Of course I'm terrified. The admission came out rough, broken. I'm about to walk into certain death because it's the only way to buy time for everyone else to escape. I'm about to become the thing I've spent my entire life trying not to be. I'm terrified that I'll like it, that once I let the wolf fully take over, I won't be able to find my way back. Then don't do it. Celine's other hand came up to cup his face. Don't walk out there alone. Let us fight beside you. Let us find another way. There is no other way. Riker closed his eyes, felt her touch like it was the only real thing left in a world turning to smoke. They're not coming here to negotiate. They're coming to end the experiment, to prove that reform equals weakness. And the only language they understand is violence. So I'm going to speak it so loudly that every house in this kingdom hears the message. What message? That you can kill the reformer but the monster survives. That pushing me too far doesn't create opportunity. It creates apocalypse. He pulled away from her touch. Couldn't bear it anymore. You need to go. His voice was harder now, controlled. Cassian will have horses ready. Take whatever guards will follow you and ride west. Don't stop until you're across the border. I'm not leaving you. Yes, you are. Make me. The challenge hung between them, and Riker felt the last pieces of his restraint crumble, because she wasn't going to walk away, wasn't going to make this easy, was going to stand there and force him to either chain her up or watch her die beside him. And he couldn't do either. Please. The word came out as a whisper, desperate. Don't make me beg. Don't make me spend my last hours knowing you're going to die because you're too stubborn to run. Celine's expression softened. Then don't go. Stay here with me. Let the Eastern armies come. Let them take the city if they want it that badly. We'll disappear together, build something new somewhere else, and abandon everyone who can't run. They're not your responsibility. Yes, they are. Riker's jaw tightened. That's what being king means. You don't get to choose who matters. Everyone matters. Every person who trusted you, who fought for you, who believed your promises about building something better. You don't abandon them just because keeping those promises costs everything, even if it costs us. Especially then. The finality in his tone was worse than any goodbye. Celine stared at him, tears streaming down her face now, not hiding them anymore. Then I hate you. Her voice broke completely. I hate you for making me love you, for making me believe we could have something real, for giving me hope and then ripping it away because you're too afraid to try living instead of dying like some tragic hero. The words should have hurt. Instead, they felt like absolution. Good. Riker turned away from her. Couldn't watch her cry anymore. Hate me. Remember me as the monster who chose death over life with you. It's better than the alternative. What alternative? Remembering me as the man who loved you and still wasn't strong enough to choose you over duty. He heard her breath catch, heard her take a step toward him, then stop. When he finally looked back, she was gone. The chambers were empty except for him and the weight of what he was about to do. Riker stood alone and let himself feel it all. The grief, the rage, the terrible certainty that he was making the right choice for all the wrong reasons. This was what leadership meant. Not the grand speeches or the symbolic gestures or the councils where everyone pretended equality mattered. This, the quiet moments before sacrifice where you decided which lives mattered more than your own. All of them, Riker thought. Every single one of them matters more than me. And that's the paradox of power that destroys most rulers eventually. The stronger you become, the more people depend on you. The more people depend on you, the less your own life matters. You stop being a person and become a symbol, a shield, a sacrifice waiting to happen. Your wants don't matter. Your fears don't matter. The only thing that matters is how many people survive because you were willing to die. It's a trap that closes slowly. So slowly you don't notice until it's already locked tight around your throat. Riker's father had avoided this trap by simply not caring, by viewing subjects as resources to be expended. But Riker had made the mistake of caring, of seeing them as people, and now he was paying the price for that compassion. He finished arming himself, checked every blade, every piece of armor, made sure everything was secured properly. Then he walked out of his chambers for the last time. The halls were emptier now, people evacuating, following Cassian's orders, getting out before the Eastern armies arrived. Good. At least something was going right. Riker made it to the main gates before someone blocked his path. Cassian stood there in full armor, sword drawn, face set in an expression Riker had seen 1,000 times on battlefields, the look of a man who'd made peace with dying. "Move," Riker said quietly. "No." The general's voice was calm, steady. "If you're going out there to die, you're not doing it alone. This isn't your fight." "The hell it isn't." Cassian moved closer. "I followed you for 15 years, fought beside you, bled for you. You think I'm going to let you walk into that army by yourself while I run away like a coward? You're following orders. I'm following my king. There's a difference." Behind Cassian, more figures emerged from the shadows. Soldiers. The ones who'd stayed loyal through the coup, through the siege, through everything. Maybe 200 of them. Armed, ready, prepared to follow their king into suicide. Riker felt something in his chest tighten. "You're all insane." His voice came out rougher than intended. "This is a death sentence. There's no victory here, no glory, just buying time with blood. Then we buy time." One of the soldiers stepped forward, a young man barely old enough to grow a beard. "If dying with you means our families have a chance to escape, that's a trade we'll make." The others murmured agreement. Riker looked at them, really looked at them, saw the fear they were trying to hide, saw the determination underneath, saw men who decided that loyalty meant more than survival. These were his people, not because they feared him, because they'd chosen him, and that choice was about to get them all killed. "Fine." Riker's voice was ice now, the wolf rising. "But when we get out there, you follow my orders exactly. No heroics, no sacrifices. You fight to survive long enough to make them regret ever marching on this city. Understood?" "Yes, my king." The response came as one voice. Cassian moved to stand beside him. "Like old times?" "Like old times." Riker gripped his general's shoulder briefly. "Except this time we're not expecting to win. We never expected to win." Cassian's expression was grim. "We just expected to make it cost. Then let's make it cost everything." They marched out through the eastern gate as the sun climbed toward noon, 200 soldiers following their king toward an army that outnumbered them 150 to 1. The math was impossible, the outcome inevitable, but they marched anyway. Because sometimes the only thing left was deciding how you went down, and Riker Voss had decided to go down fighting. The eastern plain stretched for miles beyond the city walls. Flat terrain, no cover. The kind of landscape where armies met and one side didn't leave. Riker led his small force to the center, found a slight rise that gave them maybe 10 feet of elevation. Not much, but it was something. They formed up in a defensive circle, shields facing out, spears ready. The classic formation for a last stand. Around them, the plains were empty. But not for long. The eastern armies appeared on the horizon an hour later, not marching quickly, not rushing to battle, just moving forward with the slow certainty of a force that knew victory was guaranteed. 30,000 troops spread across the plains like a living thing, cavalry on the flanks, infantry in the center, siege engines rolling forward behind ranks of archers. It looked like the end of the world. Cassian moved to stand beside Riker. His face was pale, but steady. "Any last-minute strategies?" "Don't die immediately." Riker's voice was dark. "Aim for that. Solid plan." The enemy army stopped about 200 yards away, close enough to be threatening, far enough to stay out of immediate combat range. Then the ranks parted, and 6 lords rode forward on horseback, the leaders of the Eastern Rebellion, the ones who'd coordinated this assault, who'd gathered armies from across the territories. They stopped 50 feet from Riker's position. The center lord dismounted. He was massive, easily 7 feet tall with shoulders like a bull. Lord Kragan, the head of the Eastern Council, the one who'd been pushing for Riker's removal since the reforms started. King Riker. Kragan's voice carried across the distance. Deep, mocking. I'm surprised you came out to meet us. Expected to find you cowering behind your walls. Disappointed? Riker's tone was flat. Curious. The Eastern Lord gestured at the small force surrounding Riker. This is what remains of the mighty Black Dominion? 200 men and a king who's forgotten how to rule? I haven't forgotten anything. Riker stepped forward, put himself between his soldiers and the enemy lords. I just decided there were better ways to maintain power than through constant bloodshed. And how's that working out? Kragan laughed. Your kingdom is fractured, your guards split, your nobles either dead or fled. You tried to be different and it cost you everything. Not everything. Riker's eyes began to glow silver. I still have what matters. What's that? The will to make you regret coming here. The words hung in the air. Then Kragan's expression shifted. The mockery faded, replaced by something colder. We're offering you terms. The Eastern Lord's voice was carefully controlled. Abdicate peacefully, accept exile in the Western territories. Your soldiers can return to their families unharmed. The city will be spared. And if I refuse, then we kill everyone. Kragan gestured to the army behind him. Every soldier, every guard who stayed loyal. We burn Nightbane to ash and salt the earth so nothing grows again. That's the price of your pride. Riker was silent for a moment. Let them think he was considering it. Let them believe surrender was possible. The truth was simpler and more brutal than negotiation. Some battles weren't about winning. They were about establishing cost. About making sure that even in defeat, the victor paid such a catastrophic price that the next challenger thought twice. Pyrrhic victories destroyed conquerors as surely as total defeats, and Riker was about to demonstrate exactly what it meant to fight someone who had nothing left to lose. Men with everything to protect hesitated, calculated, tried to minimize damage. But men with nothing left became something else entirely. They became weapons, and weapons didn't negotiate. Here's my counteroffer. Riker's voice dropped to a growl. Turn around. Take your armies back to whatever holes you crawled out of. And maybe I let you live long enough to regret this conversation. Kragan's expression hardened. You're in no position to make demands. I'm in exactly the position to make demands. Riker took another step forward. Because you're about to learn why my father ruled for 30 years without serious challenge. Why the Black Dominion stayed unified when every other kingdom fractured. Why the name Voss makes seasoned warriors check their doors at night. Empty threats from a cornered king. Not threats. Riker smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Promises. Then he transformed. Not slowly. Not gradually. The change ripped through him like lightning. Bones restructured with sounds like breaking branches. Muscles expanded. Skin thickened into something between flesh and armor. The hybrid form emerging in seconds. 7 feet tall. Claws like daggers. Eyes burning pure silver. Teeth that could crush steel. The Alpha King in his true form. The form his father had beaten into existence through years of brutal training. The form Riker had sworn never to use except in absolute necessity. This qualified. Kragan stepped back involuntarily. The other lords reached for weapons. Their horses reared, sensing predator. Last chance. Riker's voice was barely human now. Deep, resonant. The kind of sound that triggered flight instincts in prey animals. Leave now or learn why monsters don't negotiate. The Eastern Lord's face twisted with rage and fear. Kill him! Kill them all! The army surged forward. 30,000 troops charging toward 200. Riker didn't wait for them to arrive. He charged first. What happened next would be told in whispers for generations, would become the kind of story people didn't quite believe, would be dismissed as exaggeration by those who hadn't witnessed it. But the soldiers who survived would carry the truth in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Riker Voss became death itself. He hit the enemy lines like a force of nature. The first rank of soldiers simply ceased to exist. Torn apart, scattered, reduced to component pieces before they could raise weapons. The second rank tried to hold. Spears drove toward him from multiple angles, professional soldiers working in coordinated groups. Riker moved through them like smoke, too fast to track, too strong to stop. Claws carved through armor like it was paper. Teeth found throats. Strength that could bend steel bars tore shields from hands and used them as weapons. Behind him, his 200 soldiers hit the enemy flanks, not trying to win, just trying to create chaos, disrupt formations, make the numerical advantage harder to leverage. It worked for about 5 minutes. Then the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. The Eastern forces adapted, surrounded the small loyal force, began pressing inward from all sides. Riker's soldiers fought with desperate fury, knowing death was coming, choosing how they met it. Cassian went down fighting 5 enemies at once, took 3 with him, died with his sword buried in someone's chest and a smile on his face. The young soldier who'd spoken at the gates fell defending a wounded comrade, never saw the blade that took him. Others followed, one by one. The circle of loyalists shrinking, and still Riker fought. Wounds covered him now. Silver-tipped arrows punched through muscle. Spears had found gaps in his defenses. Blood ran from a dozen injuries that should have been fatal, but the wolf wouldn't let him fall. Not yet. Not while enemies still stood. He carved through the Eastern army with single-minded brutality. No technique now, no strategy, just raw violence, the kind that came from something more animal than man. Lord Kragan tried to rally his forces, tried to organize a coordinated assault. Riker found him in the chaos. The 2 lords met in combat that shook the ground. Kragan was skilled, powerful, had decades of experience, but Riker was fighting with nothing left to lose, and that made all the difference. The Eastern Lord fell with Riker's claws buried in his chest, eyes wide with shock. "Impossible," he gasped. "You can't! We outnumber—" "Numbers mean nothing." Riker pulled his claws free. "Let the body fall. When you're already dead, you fight different." He turned back to the army, found himself surrounded by thousands, all armed, all watching, waiting. His 200 loyalists were gone, dead, every single one. Cassian's body lay 30 feet away, already cooling. Riker stood alone in the center of an enemy army that had finally learned to fear him. But fear wasn't enough. Not against these numbers, not with his wounds. The wolf was fading now, exhaustion and blood loss finally taking their toll. The transformation wouldn't hold much longer. This was it, the end. And Riker felt something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just the quiet acceptance that came with knowing you'd done everything possible. He'd bought time, hours, maybe more. Enough for the evacuation to succeed, enough for Celine to escape. That would have to be enough. The Eastern armies began to close in, slowly, carefully. Like approaching a wounded predator, Riker raised his claws one last time, ready to take as many with him as possible. Then horns sounded from the west, loud, clear, the signal for cavalry charge. The Eastern armies turned, confused, uncertain. And Riker saw something impossible. Forces cresting the western hills. Thousands of them. Moving fast. Cavalry at the front. Infantry behind. Fresh troops bearing banners he didn't immediately recognize. The Eastern forces scrambled to reposition, trying to face this new threat while keeping Riker contained. And in that moment of chaos, Riker saw the lead rider. Saw who was commanding this unexpected reinforcement. His heart stopped, because it wasn't possible, couldn't be possible. But there she was anyway, Celine Arden, riding at the head of an army that shouldn't exist, leading forces that had no reason to follow her, charging into a battle she was supposed to have run from. And behind her, banners he finally recognized. The Western clans, the mountain tribes, the coastal lords who'd stayed neutral during every previous conflict, an alliance that should have taken months to forge, led by a servant girl who'd somehow convinced them all to ride to a doomed king's rescue. She'd done the impossible. Again. The reinforcements hit the Eastern armies like a hammer, fresh troops against exhausted soldiers. The momentum shifted instantly. Chaos exploded. The Eastern forces tried to rally, tried to maintain formation, but they were caught between Riker's position and the charging cavalry. Trapped, surrounded, everything they'd planned to do to him. The battle turned into a slaughter. Riker stood in the center of it all, bleeding and transformed and unable to process what was happening. Celine was supposed to be safe, was supposed to be miles away. Instead, she'd raised an army and ridden back to save him. One more time, the woman who kept choosing him when every logical part of her should have chosen survival. And as Riker watched her cut through enemy lines with borrowed sword and impossible courage, he realized something that changed everything. He'd been wrong. About all of it. Love wasn't weakness. It was the thing that turned one girl into an army. It was the thing that made 200 men follow their king into certain death. It was the thing that broke cycles and rebuilt kingdoms and proved that sometimes the heart was stronger than fear. Riker let the transformation fade, became human again. Stood there bleeding and broken and watching the woman he loved rewrite every rule he'd ever learned about power. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, he allowed himself to hope that maybe they'd actually survive this, together. The Eastern armies broke like waves against rocks. Celine's reinforcements tore through their formations with the kind of coordinated brutality that came from professional soldiers who'd been promised payment in land and titles. The Western clans fought with ancestral fury. The mountain tribes moved like ghosts through enemy lines. The coastal lords brought cavalry that crushed infantry beneath hooves and steel. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was an execution. Riker stood in the center of the carnage and watched his salvation arrive wearing the face of the woman he'd tried to send away. Blood covered him head to toe. Some his own, most belonging to men who'd learned too late what it meant to corner an alpha king. The transformation had faded completely now, left him human again, vulnerable, every wound screaming for attention, broken ribs grinding against each other with each breath, vision blurring at the edges from blood loss. But he was alive. Against every calculation, against all logic, against the simple mathematics that said 200 men couldn't hold against 30,000. He was still standing. Celine reached him first. Dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, ran across blood-soaked grass with a sword still gripped in her right hand. She looked like something out of nightmare. Hair matted with dirt and gore, dress torn, face streaked with someone else's blood, but her eyes were clear, focused, burning with the kind of determination that had somehow convinced an army to follow her. "You came back." Riker's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from screaming commands and breathing smoke. "I told you to run." Celine stopped 3 feet away, close enough to touch, far enough to really see him, to take in the extent of the damage. "And you told me once that you couldn't let me go." Her voice was steady, despite the tears cutting clean tracks through the blood on her face. "Guess we're both terrible at following orders." She closed the distance, grabbed him before his legs gave out, took his weight like she'd been trained for it. Riker sagged against her, let himself be held for the first time since this nightmare started. Around them, the battle was ending. The Eastern forces scattering, running, surrendering in groups. The reinforcements pursuing but not slaughtering, accepting yields, taking prisoners, professional warfare instead of total annihilation. How? The question came out broken. How did you raise an army in 2 days? "I didn't raise it in 2 days. Celine adjusted her grip, supporting more of his weight. "I raised it over 3 weeks. Every time you were in council meetings or planning defenses. Every time you thought I was just walking the city or visiting the markets. I was talking to clan leaders, mountain chiefs, coastal lords who'd stayed neutral because they didn't trust the old system." Riker pulled back enough to see her face. "You were building an alliance?" "I was building insurance." Her expression was grim, determined. "Because I knew you. Knew you'd do something like this. Knew you'd try to die heroically instead of asking for help. So I made sure help was available whether you asked for it or not." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. While he'd been preparing to sacrifice himself, she'd been constructing a safety net. Had used the same 3 weeks he'd spent doubting himself to forge connections he'd assumed were impossible. Had saved him through preparation instead of dramatic last-minute intervention. "They thought you were an ambassador," Celine continued. Her voice was quieter now. "A representative of the new Black Dominion. Someone with the king's authority to negotiate. So I negotiated. Promised land rights to the mountain tribes, trade agreements to the coastal cities, protection and autonomy to the Western clans. Everything your father refused to give because he believed in total control. And they trusted you? They trusted what you were trying to build." She met his eyes. Believed that a kingdom where power was shared instead of hoarded might actually honor its promises. I just gave them proof that the vision was real. A commander from the Western clans approached. Older man with gray in his beard and scars that spoke of decades fighting. His armor bore the mark of Clan Mordrin, one of the oldest bloodlines in the territories. "My lady." The commander bowed to Celine. Not Riker. The Eastern forces are broken. Maybe 8,000 surrendered. The rest fled toward the border. Do we pursue? Celine looked at Riker, waited. It took him a moment to understand what she was doing, deferring to him publicly, showing the alliance that she hadn't usurped his authority, that they were partners instead of conqueror and conquered. The gesture was deliberate, political, exactly the kind of thing a ruler did when building coalitions. No pursuit. Riker's voice was stronger now, steadier. Accept the surrenders. Tend their wounded alongside ours. We've had enough killing for one day. The commander nodded and withdrew. More officers appeared, reporting casualties, requesting orders. The machinery of aftermath grinding into motion. Riker handled each one, gave commands, made decisions, fell back into the rhythm of leadership, even as his body screamed for him to lie down and stop moving. But stopping meant thinking, meant processing what had just happened, and he wasn't ready for that yet. The sun was setting by the time the immediate crisis passed. The wounded had been gathered. The dead were being counted. Prisoners were secured under guard. The Eastern Plains looked like a vision of hell. Bodies everywhere, blood turning grass into mud, the smell of death thick enough to choke on. This was victory. It looked like devastation. Celine found him standing alone near the rise where his 200 had made their stand, where Cassian had died, where every soldier who'd followed him into suicide had fallen. They didn't die for nothing. Her voice came from behind him, soft, careful. Didn't they? Riker stared at the bodies being carried away on stretchers. They followed me into a battle we couldn't win. Died buying time I didn't need because you'd already arranged salvation. You didn't know that. Does it matter? His hands curled into fists. They're still dead. Cassian's still dead. 200 men who trusted me are still dead because I was so convinced sacrifice was the only option I didn't see the alternative you were building. There's a brutal lesson about leadership that most rulers learn too late or not at all. Command means carrying the weight of every decision, every order, every life spent in service of strategy. You can be right and still lose people, can make the best choice available and still watch good men die. The weight doesn't get lighter with time, doesn't become easier to bear. You just get stronger. Build calluses where the grief used to cut. Learn to function while carrying ghosts. Some kings drink to forget. Others bury themselves in work. The smart ones learn to honor the dead by making their sacrifice mean something. But that only works if you survive long enough to build something worthy of their memory. Celine moved to stand beside him, looked out at the same carnage. They followed you because they believed in what you were trying to create. Her voice was steady, believed it enough to die for it. That's not your failure, that's their choice. Honor it by making sure they didn't die protecting something that collapses the moment you're gone. And how do I do that? By accepting that you can't do it alone. She turned to face him. By trusting that the system we're building is stronger than any single person. By letting go of the idea that your death is the only currency worth spending. Riker was silent for a long moment, processing, fighting against every instinct his father had beaten into him. I don't know how to do that. The admission tasted like failure. Don't know how to rule without carrying everything on my own shoulders. Then learn. Celine's hand found his, because the alternative is burning yourself out trying to be strong enough to carry a kingdom that's too heavy for one person. They stood together as darkness fell across the battlefield, as workers lit torches and continued the grim task of sorting bodies, as the reality of what they'd survived began to settle. Around them, soldiers from 3 different territories worked side by side. Western clans treating wounded Eastern prisoners, mountain tribes sharing rations with coastal cavalry, the beginning of something that might actually resemble unity, something Riker hadn't built through conquest, something Celine had forged through negotiation and promises and the radical idea that shared power might actually be stronger than concentrated control. A messenger approached. Young woman wearing Clan Mordrin colors. Her face was carefully neutral. My king, my lady, the clan chiefs are requesting a meeting. They want to discuss terms before committing their forces to holding the city. Now? Riker's voice was sharp. We just finished fighting. They're concerned about overreach. The messenger's tone was apologetic. Want assurance that this alliance is about mutual benefit rather than absorption into the Black Dominion. Tell them we'll meet at dawn. Celine spoke before Riker could respond. Give everyone tonight to rest and tend wounds. Negotiations work better when people aren't exhausted and bleeding. The messenger bowed and left. Riker looked at Celine. You're already thinking like a ruler. I'm thinking like someone who wants this to work. She met his gaze. Someone who understands that the clans didn't come here out of loyalty to you. They came because I promised them something better than what they had. Now we have to deliver. And if we can't, then they leave and we're back where we started. Alone, surrounded by enemies, fighting the same battles over and over until someone finally wins. The stakes were clear. This wasn't just about surviving the Eastern Rebellion. It was about proving that a different kind of kingdom could exist, could thrive, could be strong enough to defend itself without resorting to tyranny. One battle didn't prove that, but it was a start. They returned to Night Bane near midnight. The city was a strange mix of celebration and mourning. People lined the streets, some cheering, others crying, everyone trying to process the fact that they'd survived. Again. Riker rode through familiar streets and felt like a stranger. Everything looked the same. The buildings, the squares, the palace rising in the distance. But he'd left this city expecting to die, had said goodbye to it in his mind. Coming back felt wrong somehow, like he'd violated the terms of an agreement he'd made with fate. The palace courtyard was packed. Guards, servants, council members who'd stayed behind, all waiting. They fell silent when Riker dismounted, staring at him like he was a ghost. Maybe he was. The healers swarmed immediately, trying to get him to the infirmary, arguing that his wounds needed immediate attention. Riker waved them off. Not yet. First we deal with the living. He made his way to the throne room, or what was left of it. The collapsed ceiling had been partially cleared, debris pushed to the sides. The obsidian throne sat crooked but intact. The room filled quickly. Council members, clan chiefs, military commanders, everyone who had a stake in what happened next. Riker stood before them without his crown, without ceremony, just a man covered in blood and held together by willpower and battlefield bandages. We won, his voice carried across the damaged hall. But winning doesn't mean the work is done. The eastern houses broke today. Tomorrow they'll regroup. Other territories will see weakness in our losses. Enemies will gather because that's what enemies do. The room was silent, listening. So here's what we're going to do. Riker's gaze swept across the assembled leaders. We're going to honor every promise made to the clans who rode to our aid. Land rights, trade agreements, autonomy. All of it. Because this alliance wasn't built on conquest, it was built on mutual benefit. And if we betray that trust, we deserve everything that comes after. Some of the nobles shifted uncomfortably, unused to a king who kept promises to those he could have simply dominated. We're going to rebuild the city, Riker continued, not as a monument to royal power, as a capital that serves everyone. The council will have real authority, real resources, real ability to make decisions without waiting for royal approval, more discomfort from the traditional faction, and we're going to bury our dead with honors usually reserved for nobility. His voice hardened. Because the men who died today weren't expendable. They were the foundation of everything we're trying to build. Their sacrifice bought us time to create something better. We honor that by making their deaths mean something. He paused. Let the words settle. This won't be easy. The old ways were simpler, clearer. You knew where you stood, knew who had power and who didn't. What we're building is messy, complicated. Will require constant negotiation and compromise and accepting that sometimes other people's ideas are better than yours. A clan chief stood, grizzled warrior with white hair and skeptical eyes. And if it fails? If this experiment in shared power makes us too weak to defend ourselves? Then we fail trying to be better instead of succeeding at being exactly what we've always been. Riker met the chief's gaze without flinching. I'm tired of perpetuating cycles, tired of watching kingdoms tear themselves apart because the only model we have is domination or submission. So we try something different, and if it kills us, at least we die knowing we attempted change. The chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, sat back down. More questions followed. Logistical, political. The practical concerns of people trying to figure out how this new system would actually function. Riker answered what he could. Deferred to Celine for questions about clan agreements. Let council members speak to resource allocation, shared power in action, messy, imperfect, but functional. The meeting lasted hours. By the end, rough frameworks had been established, committees formed, responsibilities delegated, the machinery of a new kind of government grinding into motion. When the hall finally emptied, Riker found himself alone with Celine again. She looked exhausted, swaying slightly on her feet, but still standing. "You should rest." He moved closer. "You've been awake for 2 days straight. So have you." She didn't move toward the door. "And you're still bleeding through your bandages. Healers can wait. There's something I need to say first." Celine waited. Riker took a breath. Felt broken ribs protest. Ignored them. "I was wrong." The words came out rough, difficult, about everything. About thinking I could protect people by dying for them. About believing sacrifice was the only currency that mattered. About trying to shoulder everything alone because accepting help felt like weakness. "You were trying to be what you thought a king should be. I was trying to be my father." He shook his head, trying to prove I could be strong enough to carry a kingdom through sheer force of will. "But you showed me something different. Showed me that real strength isn't about how much weight you can carry alone. It's about building systems strong enough to distribute that weight. And here's the fundamental truth about power that takes most rulers a lifetime to understand. The more you concentrate it, the more fragile it becomes. One assassination, one moment of weakness, one wrong decision, and everything collapses. But power that's distributed, shared, woven through multiple people and structures, that's resilient. Can survive the loss of any single person, can adapt to changing circumstances, can outlive the people who created it. It's harder to build. Requires trusting others with authority you could hoard. Demands accepting that sometimes consensus is slower than decree. But what you lose in efficiency, you gain in durability. And durability is what separates kingdoms that last from kingdoms that burn. Celine's expression softened. "You're learning, slowly." He managed a tired smile. Painfully. "But learning." She moved closer. Close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of everything she'd carried while he'd been preparing to die. "I need you to promise me something." Her voice was quiet, serious. "Anything. Stop trying to die heroically." She put her hand against his chest, right over his heart where the rhythm was finally starting to slow. "I get it. You were raised to believe that sacrifice was the highest form of leadership, that dying for your people proved you were worthy of ruling them. But I need you alive more than I need you martyred." The admission cracked something open inside him, because nobody had ever said that before, had ever valued his survival over his utility, had ever wanted him to live for reasons that had nothing to do with what he could provide. "I promise." The words came out as a vow, as binding as any oath. "I'll stop looking for ways to die and start figuring out how to live." Celine pulled him down into a kiss that tasted like blood and smoke, and the desperate relief of people who'd survived something they shouldn't have. When they finally pulled apart, Riker rested his forehead against hers. "I love you." The confession was easier than he'd expected. Terrifying, but simple. Not the obsession I tried to pretend was love before, not possession disguised as affection. Just love. The kind where your happiness matters more than my control. Tears streaked down Celine's face. "I love you too. Even when you're being an idiot, even when you're trying to save everyone by destroying yourself, even when you forget that you're worth saving too." They stood together in the ruins of the throne room while the city slept fitfully around them. Two broken people who'd somehow found each other in the chaos. Who'd built something real from the wreckage of failed systems and shattered assumptions. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no guarantees, no promises that the reforms would work, no certainty that the alliance would hold or the kingdom would survive. But it was honest, and sometimes honest was better than perfect. Dawn came with the smell of rain. Riker stood on the eastern wall watching gray clouds roll in from the plains. His wounds had finally been properly treated. Ribs wrapped, gashes stitched, enough painkillers in his system that breathing didn't feel like being stabbed. The city below was already stirring. Workers clearing rubble, merchants reopening shops, the slow process of recovery beginning. In the distance, he could see the battlefield, crews still working to bury the dead, Thousands of bodies waiting for final rites. Cassian would be among them. The general who'd followed him for 15 years, who'd questioned him and supported him and ultimately died buying time that hadn't been needed. Riker would carry that weight for the rest of his life, but he'd carry it while building something worthy of the sacrifice. Footsteps approached from behind. He didn't turn, already knew who it was. The clan chiefs want an answer about the territorial agreements. Celine moved to stand beside him. They're worried you'll change your mind once the immediate crisis passes. I won't. They don't know that. Her voice was gentle. They've spent decades watching rulers promise change and deliver more of the same. You need to give them proof. What kind of proof? The kind that can't be taken back. She handed him a document. I had the council draft this last night. It's a charter. Legally binding. Gives the clans autonomous control over their territories in exchange for mutual defense and trade agreements. Once you sign it, it becomes law. Can't be undone without majority council approval. Riker read through the document, saw his power being formally limited, saw rights being granted that previous kings would have considered treasonous to even suggest, saw the foundation of a system that might actually survive him. He signed without hesitation. Celine took the document, looked at his signature, then at him. You know what you just did? You gave up the absolute power your father spent 30 years consolidating. Good. Riker's voice was firm. Absolute power is what nearly destroyed this kingdom. Time to try something different. She smiled. Actually smiled. The first genuine expression of happiness he'd seen from her in days. You're going to be a good king. The words were soft, certain. Not the king your father was. Not the king the nobles want, but the king this kingdom needs. The assessment settled over him like a weight he could actually carry, because she was right. He'd never be the tyrant his father wanted him to be, would never rule through fear and domination and the absolute certainty of his own superiority. But maybe he could be something better, could be the king who admitted weakness, who asked for help, who built systems designed to outlive him instead of crumbling the moment he fell. Could be human instead of monster, and if that humanity made him vulnerable, so be it. Vulnerability was the price of connection, of trust, of building something real instead of maintaining something hollow. The rain started, light at first, then heavier, washing blood from the streets below, cleaning the city in preparation for whatever came next. Riker stood in it without seeking shelter. Let the water soak through his clothes, let it carry away some of the weight. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough to keep moving forward. Celine stayed beside him, equally soaked, equally unbothered. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now we rebuild. Riker watched the rain fall on his broken kingdom. We honor the dead. We keep the promises we made. We figure out how to make this alliance work even when it's hard. We make mistakes and own them and try to do better. That's not much of a plan. It's the only plan we have.